July 28, 1866. The air in Washington City hung hot and wet as members of the 39th Congress filed into the House chamber and took their seats beneath the high ceiling and gas chandeliers. Ink, sweat, and tobacco clung to the room while clerks stacked papers at the front desk and read out the name of the newest measure to reorganize the United States Army after 4 years of civil war. On the parchment before them sat a bill titled in formal language, "An Act to Increase and Fix the Military Peace Establishment of the United States," a law that would decide what kind of army would police a fractured country. Many of the men in those crowded benches still carried the memory of battlefields from Virginia to Georgia and knew what black soldiers had done when the Union was on the line. Reports of charges at places like Fort Wagner and the steady work of black regiments along riverbanks and in muddy trenches had reached this chamber years earlier. And some legislators now quoted those records as proof that black men had earned a permanent place in the regular army. Others shifted in their chairs and spoke of politics, patronage, and budget rather than courage, unwilling to give public credit to men they still refused to treat as equals. When the clerk read the section that authorized 6 regiments composed of black enlisted men, 4 of infantry and 2 of cavalry, the tone of the room sharpened. The lines spelled out that these units would be part of the regular establishment, not temporary wartime formations, and that they would be officered by white men appointed through normal procedures. Pay for the enlisted men would match that of other regulars, $13 each month for privates, along with rations, clothing, and shelter, and they would serve for standard enlistment terms. Outside the Capitol, the city's streets held veterans missing arms, freed people looking for work, and families trying to rebuild, none of whom knew yet that a handful of sentences on that page had for the first time allowed black Americans to enlist in permanent regular army regiments of cavalry and infantry. Debate moved between the houses and through committees, and language was adjusted, but the essential provision remained. Supporters repeated that black soldiers had fought and died under the flag and that their service had helped save the Union. Opponents warned that making black regiments permanent would anger white voters, would blur racial lines inside the army, and would invite friction within white frontier communities. In the end, enough men decided that the country needed a larger peacetime force to occupy the South and guard the West, and that black troops, if kept in segregated units with white officers, could meet that need without fully disturbing the racial order they still protected. At the White House, President Andrew Johnson received the act after it passed both houses. He had clashed with Congress over Reconstruction and vetoed other measures, but on this one he signed his name. The ink that dried across the page on that July day made the provisions law. Among its paragraphs sat the authorization for a regiment that would be numbered 9th United States Cavalry and another that would be numbered 10th United States Cavalry, both to be filled with black enlisted men. No one in that office considered how often those 2 regiments would ride at the edge of settlement, or how many miles their horses would cover in country most of the men in the Capitol would never see. Word of the new units moved outward by telegraph and letter from the War Department. Senior officers received orders to begin the slow work of organizing regiments that existed only as lines in a statute. Circulars described the structure each cavalry regiment would follow, 12 companies of roughly 70 men each when fully filled, with a colonel, lieutenant colonel, majors, and captains commanding them. These officers would be white, drawn from wartime volunteers with good records or from existing regular Army officers willing to transfer, while the enlisted strength would come from black communities across the South and border states and from veterans of United States colored troops. In Louisiana, Kentucky, and other former slave states, the news spread unevenly. In some towns, freedmen who had worn Union blue during the war learned from former non-commissioned officers or chaplains that the regular army now wanted black cavalrymen. In country parishes where few newspapers arrived, word came more slowly, carried by travelers and by men who moved between levee camps, plantations, and port cities seeking wages. For many of these men, work since the surrender had meant short-term contracts in fields that looked too much like the old plantations, labor gangs on railroad grades under overseers with whips, or odd jobs that ended with an employer refusing to pay full wages. The prospect of steady army pay drew attention in ways that no abstract talk of policy in Washington ever could. $13 a month, issued regularly at posts where officers kept rolls and records, meant coin in a man's hand and rations that did not depend on the goodwill of a planter or contractor. An enlistment term offered shelter in barracks instead of dependence on a landlord who could throw a family out with little warning. At the same time, the uniforms and weapons represented something more, a visible claim to citizenship at a time when most Southern whites insisted that black men had no rightful place with a rifle and bayonet in hand. Recruiting officers set up tables in New Orleans and other cities as the War Department's orders took shape. Men who had fought in United States colored infantry regiments arrived with crumpled discharge papers tucked into jackets, some still bearing scars from musket balls or prison camps. Others came from fields and riverfront job lines, unfamiliar with drill but hardened by years of forced labor. Some younger volunteers had been boys when the war ended and now wanted to step into a uniform that older brothers or uncles had worn. They lined up, answered questions about age and health, and placed their names on enlistment papers that committed them to 5 years of cavalry service. Doctors working for the Army checked teeth, chests, and limbs, rejecting men with damaged lungs, bad eyes, or missing fingers. Clothing clerks issued wool trousers, coarse shirts, and dark shell jackets in whatever sizes were available, not always matching the men who received them. In New Orleans heat, the heavy fabric trapped sweat, but the jackets marked the wearers as soldiers of the United States, not laborers hired by the day. Many recruits received worn surplus equipment and mounts that other regiments did not want, with saddles patched by earlier users and carbines whose stocks bore old regimental numbers. Officers assigned to the 9th Cavalry arrived with their own expectations. Colonel Edward Hatch, a veteran cavalryman, took command knowing that this regiment would be watched by supporters and skeptics alike. Some of his junior officers accepted the assignment because it offered quick promotion or a way to stay in uniform after wartime volunteer regiments disbanded. Others asked quietly whether a regiment of black troopers could ever match white units in the field, voicing doubts shaped by prejudice rather than by any record of performance. Those attitudes shaped early training where some officers pushed hard to prove a point while others treated their commands as punishment duty. The 9th Cavalry began to take real form at Greenville near New Orleans as companies filled and men learned to move as mounted soldiers rather than isolated recruits. Bugle calls split the humid air before dawn. Recruits rolled from rough wooden bunks, pulled on sweat-damp uniforms, formed ranks in company streets, and learned to respond quickly to shouted orders. Instructors drilled them in the basics of handling carbines and revolvers, breaking down weapons, cleaning barrels, and firing at wooden targets set against levee walls or open ground beyond the camp perimeter. Every misstep drew correction in sharp language, but the men adjusted. Horses arrived by rail and riverboat, a mix of animals pulled from dealers' strings and surplus herds. Experienced handlers among the enlisted men stepped forward to steady nervous mounts and show new troopers how to curry, feed, and saddle properly. Poor quality animals stumbled or balked under new riders, and some men hit the ground hard in the first weeks. Drill sergeants ignored bruises and ordered the men back into saddles. The regiment worked through close order maneuvers in dusty parade grounds, learning to wheel by fours, extend into skirmish lines, and reform column on command. Because on the plains, a broken formation meant death. Far to the north and west at Fort Leavenworth in Kansas, the eyes of the 10th Cavalry followed a similar path under Colonel Benjamin Grierson. The post overlooked the Missouri River and sat near a frontier town where ox-drawn wagons rolled past saloons and warehouses. Officers and enlisted families at the fort filled with rumor and speculation when word spread that an all-black cavalry regiment would be organized there. Some white residents treated the news with open contempt, telling one another that black troops lacked discipline and would never match white horse soldiers. The fort commander himself opposed the presence of black regulars and used his authority to make their early months difficult. When the first companies of the 10th marched into the post, they carried light gear and stiff new uniforms, but their reception was cold. The men were assigned to cramped quarters and given menial fatigue details that fell outside normal training schedules. Local civilians watched them in town with narrowed eyes and refused service in some establishments. Despite that treatment, the troopers filed into drill fields each day and worked through riding lessons, weapons training, and guard duty. Grierson pressed for fair treatment from above and sought transfer to a post where his regiment could train without constant interference from a hostile superior. The 10th's enlisted men came from many of the same sources as the 9th's companies, including former Union soldiers and freedmen seeking a path out of poverty. They faced the added strain of Kansas winters and the open scorn of some white soldiers stationed nearby. Yet as weeks passed, their riding improved, fire discipline tightened, and company-level drills began to match the standards that Army inspectors expected. In reports sent east, visiting officers noted the regiment's orderly barracks, polished equipment, and steady bearing on parade, even as they quietly recorded continuing prejudice from the fort's senior white leadership. Beyond these training grounds, the western country that the 9th and 10th would soon ride into remained unstable. Trails that ran from Texas into Kansas and Colorado carried longhorn herds north. Mining camps sprang up and died quickly, drawing men chasing quick money. Along those routes, gangs of thieves, deserters, and gunmen watched for weakly guarded wagons and isolated travelers. Stage lines that carried mail and passengers across open country had been hit repeatedly during the war, and continued to lose coaches and stock to raiders who knew every arroyo and cutoff. Local sheriffs lacked the manpower to patrol more than a fraction of the territory under their jurisdiction. News of black cavalry regiments forming in Louisiana and Kansas filtered into these circles through newspapers and travelers' talk. In dim saloons along the cattle trails and in border towns, men who made their living from stolen stock or robbery scoffed when they heard that Washington wanted black troopers to police the plains. Many of them already despised federal authority, and the idea that black soldiers would ride with United States on their saddle blankets only sharpened their contempt. To these men, the 9th and 10th sounded like experiments that would collapse as soon as the first cold front swept across the high country or the first hard fight erupted along a lonely road. While such talk spread in the West, the new regiments focused on meeting Army standards. Paymasters worked through rolls and began issuing the promised wages at muster. With that money, some troopers sent small sums back to families in southern towns, using bankers or trusted agents where possible. Others bought better boots or small personal items that made barracks life more bearable. Chaplains preached on Sundays, reading from worn Bibles in simple services that offered a brief break from drill and duty. Letters from home brought news of elections, violence, and fragile attempts to build new lives under Reconstruction. The 9th and 10th remained under strength through their first months. Recruiting never completely filled all companies, and desertion took some men who realized they could not adapt to Army discipline or who balked at the long enlistment term. Illness and injury claimed others. Yet slowly, the units began to look like functioning regiments rather than scattered gatherings of new volunteers. Non-commissioned officers emerged from the ranks, men who understood orders quickly and could enforce standards without constant supervision from white lieutenants. Their presence gave younger troopers someone to follow besides distant officers whose attitudes varied widely. By the time autumn stood around the parade grounds as leaves turned color in Louisiana and cold winds swept Kansas, the 9th and 10th Cavalry had passed through their first inspections. Their record showed thousands of rounds fired in practice, hundreds of hours in the saddle, and days spent on guard posts along local roads and rail lines. Reports from Army inspectors acknowledged solid progress, even when phrased in the stiff formal language of the era. In corners of those same reports, comments about the behavior of nearby civilians and garrison officers hinted at the racial tension that still thickened around the regiments wherever they moved. The act signed in Washington that summer had given shape to 2 cavalry regiments that were now almost ready for field service, but law and drill alone could not remove the assumptions that surrounded them. In the minds of many officers and in the talk of hard men scattered across the frontier, black soldiers were still expected to falter under real pressure. The coming years would test those expectations in the most direct way imaginable, as the 9th and 10th left their training grounds and moved toward the long, violent edge of settlement where raiders, bandits, and hostile forces believed they held the advantage. June 29th, 1867. Dawnlight slid over the dry ridges around Fort Stockton while a column of black cavalrymen rode in from the east, dust hanging over them in a pale brown curtain. Their uniforms were already streaked with salt and trail grime from weeks of movement across Texas. Horses blew hard through flared nostrils as the column slowed near the low stone buildings that made up the post. Farther west, at Fort Davis in the jagged Davis Mountains, other companies of the same regiment pushed into a canyon town that had stood empty since the war, eyes scanning ruined walls for any sign of trouble. On that date, the 9th United States Cavalry began active duty on the West Texas frontier with understrength companies scattered between Fort Stockton, Fort Davis, and smaller detachments along the line. The landscape they entered did not pretend to be welcoming. Around Fort Stockton, the land rolled in low, hard swells of pale soil and thin grass, broken by patches of prickly pear and mesquite that tore at clothing and hide. Summer heat pressed down before midday, turning the air into something felt as much as breathed. Water stood only where springs forced it to the surface, thin veins of damp soil surrounded by a little brush and trampled mud. Fort Stockton itself was no grand fortress, just scattered stone and adobe buildings near Comanche Springs, built to cover the San Antonio to El Paso road that cut across the open country. Fort Davis sat at the mouth of a narrow canyon where a line of cottonwoods followed a creek through volcanic ridges, the only consistent water for many miles. At both posts, white officers and civilian onlookers watched as these new black troopers dismounted and formed ranks. Some of the white regulars, veterans from older regiments, had heard the doubts voiced earlier that spring in San Antonio when the 9th Cavalry experienced serious disciplinary trouble while still half-trained. There had been an episode that officers described in reports as a mutiny, a violent clash that required quick, forceful response to reimpose control. When word spread that the same regiment was now being sent to garrison a long stretch of frontier, many Texans repeated predictions that the unit would fold under pressure. Orders from department headquarters left no room for delay. The 9th Cavalry received a simple but dangerous assignment to open and protect the mail and stage route from San Antonio to El Paso, to maintain order along the Rio Grande frontier where raiding and cross-border theft had surged during the war, and to find and push roving Apache, Comanche, and Kiowa bands back toward designated reservations. Smaller written instructions set out how many men would be posted at particular springs, how often patrols would ride, and how escorts would be arranged for civilian and government wagons. The line the regiment was expected to hold stretched hundreds of miles from posts on the lower Rio Grande through Fort Stockton and Fort Davis to Fort Quitman near the pass that led into the El Paso region. From the first week, the work looked different from parade ground drill in Louisiana or training camps near San Antonio. At Fort Davis, Lieutenant Colonel Wesley Merritt stood with officers from companies C, F, H, and I, looking up at bare slopes above the canyon. The task list before him included rebuilding an abandoned post, establishing picket lines and corrals, and sending small detachments to stage stations such as Barilla Springs and Barrel Springs. Those stations, little more than clusters of crude structures and corrals on barren flats, needed soldiers on site to discourage attack. Men detailed to these outposts would sleep in rough shelters or dugouts, cook over open fires, and watch the horizon both day and night. Stage drivers and mail contractors already knew how vulnerable the route could be. During the war, with regular troops withdrawn, raiders had burned stations, killed stock tenders, and driven off horses and mules. Some of those men now leaned in saloon doorways at San Antonio, Fort Stockton, or small settlements, listening when news arrived that black troops were being sent to guard the line. The idea of black soldiers in regular Army blue still drew open scorn from many white Texans. In that environment, talk turned quickly to whether these new cavalrymen would stand fast if hit by a determined band of Comanches, or if they would break and run, leaving stages and ranches exposed again. That talk did not change the orders that sent the 9th Cavalry out along the road. Companies were divided to cover more ground. Regimental headquarters and several troops under Colonel Edward Hatch took post at Fort Stockton. Other companies under Merritt moved into Fort Davis. Additional troopers rotated through Fort Lancaster, Fort Concho, and smaller sites, strung along the San Antonio to El Paso road. Each detachment rode with worn carbines and revolvers, cartridge belts heavy on their hips, and government-issued saddles that were not always in good repair. On some posts, black troopers received inferior mounts compared to nearby white units, including mules labeled as suitable for mounted infantry rather than prime cavalry horses. They accepted what they were issued and began patrols. A typical escort assignment started before first light. A small guard detail from one of the companies at Fort Stockton formed up in the dim parade ground while a stagecoach driver checked harness on his team. The soldiers climbed into saddles, checked straps and cartridge boxes, and rode out ahead and behind the coach as it left the post. Dust from the stage drifted back over them. The escort moved with eyes on the low ridges flanking the road, knowing that raiders who wanted horses or cargo would look for stretches where the trail dropped into arroyos or wound between rocky outcrops. Silence often stretched for hours in the heat, broken only by the clank of tack and the creak of the coach body. When escorts halted at a stage station, troopers dismounted and walked the perimeter, checking for fresh sign. A soldier bending to examine prints in the dust might spot pony tracks crossing the road at an angle, hooves lighter and more compact than government horses. If those tracks were new and accompanied by moccasin prints, the escort tightened security. At Barilla Springs or Barrel Springs, where a few wooden barrels or shallow pools provided precious water, soldiers refilled their canteens while keeping rifles within reach. Civilians inside the station buildings watched these black cavalrymen with a mixture of hope and suspicion, grateful for armed support but not always ready to accept the men who provided it as equals. The dangers along the line did not come only from raiding native bands. On both sides of the Rio Grande, men who had learned to steal stock and move contraband during the war continued the trade. Some were Mexican Comancheros who acted as middlemen between tribes and buyers in northern Mexico. Others were white men, including former Confederate soldiers who refused to accept defeat and now lived by robbery, smuggling, or hired gun work. Trails that crossed the Pecos and Rio Grande sometimes carried stolen horses herded at night, and ranches near the border complained repeatedly about animals disappearing and herds being cut. Orders to the 9th Cavalry did not distinguish between raiders based on origin. Patrol leaders received instructions to intercept any armed party found driving off stock or attacking settlements, and to recover property whenever possible. This meant that black troopers assigned to protect stage and mail traffic now found themselves confronting Apache or Comanche war parties in one week, and mixed groups of Comancheros and white outlaws in another. The complexity of those encounters rarely appeared in short official summaries, but it shaped the daily experience of men posted along the line. They had to read sign, judge whether small clusters of riders were innocent travelers or scouts for a larger band, and decide when to give chase across open country with only a handful of fellow troopers at their side. In early autumn, tension around Fort Lancaster deepened. The fort stood near the Pecos, guarding an important crossing point on the road. Its buildings, a mix of stone and adobe, rose on a terrace above the riverbed. From the parade ground, a soldier could look out over low brush and the faint line of wagon ruts that climbed a nearby hill. Company K of the 9th Cavalry held the post that year. The men drilled between fatigue duties, tended horses, and kept watch on the approaches. Their routines were broken by occasional alarms, chasing reports of raiding parties or escorting mail. On one day in early October, 2 9th Cavalry troopers were killed near Howard's Well while riding guard for mail, a reminder that any escort run could become a last ride with little warning. Word of such incidents moved quickly through the frontier. In saloons along the Pecos and in scattered ranch houses, some white settlers expressed anger that the cavalry, despite increased patrols, had not stopped every raid. A few blamed the quality of the troops rather than the scale of the task, returning to the claim that black soldiers could not match white units in combat. Men who made their living on stolen stock or smuggling listened to these complaints and sometimes joined them, confident that distance, rough ground, and surprise would still favor raiders over any regular soldiers sent against them. In the weeks leading up to Christmas, the air around Fort Lancaster grew colder, though midday heat still climbed when clouds cleared. Company K maintained its routines. Soldiers rose in the dim morning, led horses to water, and filed into uneven lines for roll call. Some men wrapped issue blankets around their shoulders when night winds cut through their barracks. Talk in the company rooms ranged from pay and promotions to the difficulty of guarding so long a road with limited men. Still, patrols went out. A patrol leader might take 20 troopers to ride a loop past Howard's Well and other points, returning to the fort with reports of signs seen or travelers encountered. On the morning of December 26, 1867, soldiers from Company K moved their horses toward pasture near the fort. The routine act of turning animals out to graze had to be balanced with constant awareness of attack, but the post had not seen a major assault before that day. As some troopers guided horses and mules away from the main buildings, riders appeared in the distance, then more behind them. What first looked like a small mounted party quickly revealed itself as a large force advancing toward the post, Kickapoo warriors with allies from other groups pushing forward in a long, spreading line. Estimates in later accounts placed their number high enough to threaten the entire garrison if they could reach the herd and the walls. Men of Company K reacted under orders rather than panic. Troopers nearest the loose horses turned them back toward the fort's corral, shouting and swinging arms to keep the animals moving while arrows and bullets began to fall around them. Others ran for weapons, grabbing carbines and cartridge belts and taking positions behind low walls, stone piles, or shallow earthworks. Officers shouted instructions across the grounds, placing men where they could cover the most likely avenues of approach. Smoke from the first volleys drifted across the fort as gunfire rolled back and forth. Some soldiers fired, then moved to fresh positions to avoid presenting easy targets. Out in the pasture, a few men faced an impossible trade-off, whether to stay with the horses and risk being cut off or abandon some animals to reach defensible positions. Raiders aimed to stampede the herd, knowing that taking government horses and mules would cripple the fort's ability to patrol and escort. Troopers drove as many animals as they could manage back toward the corral, but attackers closed in from multiple sides. The ground shook under the combined weight of running stock and charging ponies. Bullets struck animals, sending them crashing to the dirt. Men who fell in that confusion did so amid hooves, dust, and the sharp crack of carbines fired at close range. The fighting stretched into the night. Company K used walls and building corners to turn parts of the fort into strong points, firing in controlled volleys when groups of attackers pressed close, then conserving ammunition when the raiders fell back out of range. The attackers poured fire into the post from rifles and bows, seeking to pin the defenders and find gaps. Horses in the corral screamed and milled, some breaking free in terror and rushing toward openings where raiders tried to drive them off. Under cover of darkness, small groups of warriors slipped close to cut loose animals or probe the defenses, and the defenders answered with scattered shots and shouted warnings. By the time dawn light returned to the Pecos Valley, the main fight was over. The attackers had taken many animals, a heavy loss for a frontier cavalry company, and had inflicted fatal wounds on several troopers. Accounts differ on the exact number of soldiers killed, but they agree that Company K held the post and prevented the fort itself from being overrun. The defenders remained in control of their walls and most of their weapons. Spent cartridge cases lay thick around firing positions, and blood stained the ground where men and horses had fallen. News of the Battle of Fort Lancaster moved along telegraph lines and traveled with couriers and stage passengers. Accounts emphasized that a company of black cavalrymen, heavily outnumbered and hit by a force that included determined Kickapoo fighters and associated raiders, had held firm through hours of pressure. Descriptions noted the number of attackers, the scale of the animal losses, and the refusal of Company K to abandon its position. For men in other parts of Texas who had claimed that black troopers would collapse in a serious fight, the events at Fort Lancaster presented direct evidence to the contrary. Among stage drivers and mail contractors on the San Antonio to El Paso road, the story of that day became part of the route's living memory. When new escorts from the 9th Cavalry rode out from Fort Stockton or Fort Davis after December, some civilians looked at them differently, aware that men wearing the same branch insignia had already stood up to a large force and kept a fort from falling. The road remained dangerous. Raids, ambushes, and thefts continued. Yet the Battle of Fort Lancaster marked one of the early major engagements in Texas where Buffalo soldiers fought as a unit and showed, in direct measured fire and stubborn defense, that they could meet violent assault in one of the harshest environments on the frontier. May 20th, 1870. The first light at Fort McCavitt caught the edges of low limestone walls and the dark line of live oaks along the shallow river as a bugle call cut through the quiet. Inside the stone parade ground, a small group of 9th Cavalry troopers stood near saddled horses, carbines already slung and canteens filled. At their head, Sergeant Emmanuel Stantz checked the line, counting men and mounts with a quick, practiced glance. 10 riders, 10 horses, 1 pack animal for ammunition and rations. The patrol left the gate within minutes of sunrise, hooves striking the packed earth as they turned toward the rough country north of the post and the place called Kickapoo Springs. 4 days earlier, news had reached Fort McCavitt that a raiding party had struck a farmstead to the east, seized 2 boys from a field, and taken several good horses. The report named the children as brothers from a German family that had cut fields out of the edge of the hill country, and said that the warriors had moved off quickly with their captives and stolen stock. Settlers closer to the post had heard gunfire in the distance and watched smoke rise on the horizon before the sound faded. The story arrived at the fort in pieces, carried by frightened civilians and then shaped into a formal message that landed on an officer's desk above the parade ground. The local commander understood what that raid meant. A successful kidnapping encouraged further attacks on isolated farms, and each lost horse weakened the ability of settlers to bring crops in or flee danger. Orders went out for a mounted party to move at once and find the trail. Sergeant Stantz received those orders in the orderly room, signed the small form that documented the assignment, and stepped out to assemble his men. He chose experienced troopers from Company F, men he knew from earlier scouts who could read sign on rocky ground and stay calm under fire. They checked Spencer carbines for clean chambers and working extractors, examined Colt revolvers for smooth cylinder movement, and secured cartridge boxes across their belts. The route north from Fort McCavitt rose from the river valley to higher ground cut by shallow ravines. Thin grass and low brush covered most of the surface, with scattered stands of oak and cedar marking draws where water sometimes lingered after rain. Rocks broke through the soil in ledges and loose fragments that shifted under hooves. By mid-morning, the cool of dawn had gone and heat rolled up from the pale stone. Stantz kept the column at a steady walk, preserving the horses for the work ahead. He sent one trooper out as point and another to watch the flank, keeping the main group slightly back where it could respond to trouble. Near a dry creek bed, the point rider raised an arm and bent low in the saddle, signaling a find. The patrol came up and dismounted. On the bare ground near the crossing lay prints that did not come from government mounts. Pony tracks, smaller and lighter than cavalry horses, formed a line across the creek. Mixed with them were deeper horse prints with shoe marks unlike the standard patterns issued at army posts. Among the hoof marks, boot prints and moccasin tracks ran side by side, some fresher than others. In the dust between them lay a scrap of cloth that did not match any army color, a strip of coarse fabric torn from civilian clothing. One of the troopers held it up and pointed out a faint line of dried blood along one edge. Stantz studied the sign without wasting words. The spacing of the prints told him that the raiding party had not been moving at full speed when it crossed there, but the sharp edges along the fresher tracks showed they were still ahead by only a short distance. He ordered the men back into their saddles and set the column along the line of travel, careful to keep off the main trace so that their own horses did not destroy the trail. The patrol advanced by bounds, following the route where it cut around low hills and across flat stretches where dust lay in a thin skin over baked ground. North of a stony ridge, the ground sloped toward broken plains where cedar and scrub oak grew in clumps among scattered boulders. Here the signs strengthened. Stantz and his point man found places where the raiders had driven horses through tight spots, scuffing bark from trees and knocking stones aside. In one gap they saw where a horse had stumbled hard, cutting a hoof and leaving a small smear of blood on the rock. The trail led toward a cluster of low hills that sheltered the springs which gave the area its name. Everyone in the region knew that any party moving through that country with stolen stock would need to reach those pools sooner or later. In the early afternoon, as the patrol crested a low rise, the point trooper jerked his horse to a halt and dropped flat along its neck. Below, on a strip of open ground near the springs, moved a line of riders and loose horses. The animals were strung out in a rough column, heads down, flanks marked by dust and dried sweat. Warriors rode along the flanks, some bareheaded, others wearing headbands or hats taken in earlier raids. Spears and rifles rested across their arms. The raiding party had no reason to expect federal cavalry so soon and kept its main attention on keeping the herd together. Stantz brought his men up behind the crest and issued orders in a low voice. There was no time to send back for support. The patrol would have to hit the raiders hard enough to throw them off balance and recover what they could in the first rush. He split his detachment into two groups. One would follow him in a direct charge aimed at the center of the moving column. The second would angle slightly to the right to cut off the herd and drive it toward a patch of broken ground where it could be held under carbine fire. Troopers checked their saddles and weapons one last time. Carbine hammers were thumbed back. Revolver holsters were unsnapped. At Stance's signal, the patrol rode over the rise at a trot that built quickly into a hard run. Horses lunged forward, hooves pounding. Riders crouched low with carbines at the ready. The distance between the crest and the raiders narrowed as shouts rose from the line near the springs. Warriors turned in their saddles, surprised by the sudden appearance of cavalry so close at hand. Some tried to swing the herd away. Others reached for rifles and fired hurried shots uphill. Bullets cracked through the air, but the short range gave the troopers little time to think about incoming fire. Within moments, Stance and the lead riders were close enough to see individual faces and markings on the stolen horses. He shouted a brief command, and the front rank leveled Spencer carbines, firing into the raiders' line. The repeaters sent out a fast series of reports as each man worked his lever, brass cases ejecting in a steady rhythm. Horses and riders in the raiding party went down under the sudden volley. The main herd broke in confusion, some animals bolting away from the fire, others circling blindly. The second group of troopers pushed in from the side, waving arms and firing over the backs of the horses to steer them toward the rougher ground Stance wanted. The close-range fight lasted only minutes. The raiders realized how badly the odds had shifted and pulled back toward the hills, firing scattered shots as they went. The cavalry patrol held its ground rather than chase them into broken terrain where an ambush might turn the tables. Troopers fanned out to gather loose stock, catching reins and halters, calming panicked animals with firm hands and short commands. Among the horses, they found several with brands that matched marks recorded at the post and others with fresh rawhide hobbles and rope burns, clear signs of recent capture. During the confusion of the first charge, one of the kidnapped boys had found a chance. As horses milled and gunfire rolled over the springs, he slipped from where he had been held and ran toward the only direction that offered hope: the sudden gap in the raiders' line where cavalrymen now rode. A trooper saw the small figure in torn clothes sprinting through dust and called out. Stance turned in his saddle, assessed the risk, and ordered a temporary halt to the advance in that sector so no stray shot would strike the child. The boy reached the edge of the herd and collapsed against a cavalry horse's shoulder, gasping for air. When the shooting stopped, the troopers pulled him into the middle of the group and checked him for wounds. He trembled, eyes wide, answering questions in halting German-accented English. From his account, Stance confirmed that the raiders had taken both brothers in the first attack, but that only one had broken free in the chaos. The other had been dragged back as the warriors began to withdraw, still tied to a horse. The news told him two things at once. The patrol had succeeded in freeing one captive and disrupting the raiding party, but the mission remained incomplete. There was still a child in enemy hands somewhere among those hills. With the sun dropping and the horses already tired from the long ride and sudden charge, Stance had decisions to make. Pushing deeper into unfamiliar rocky ground in fading light with 10 men and a rescued boy risked losing everything gained. Staying at the springs gave raiders a chance to circle back in the dark and strike from cover. He chose a defensive posture. The patrol collected as many of the stolen horses as they could manage and pulled back to a position where a low rise and scattered rocks provided cover. There they formed a rough camp, posted guards, and settled in for a short, tense night. Fires were kept small and shielded. Men took turns standing watch while others rested on their blankets with weapons within reach. The rescued boy lay near the center of the position, wrapped in an extra coat. He woke repeatedly at small sounds, but each time a trooper spoke a few quiet words to calm him. In the darkness beyond their circle, movements and distant calls suggested that the raiders remained in the area. probing for weakness or considering a new attack. Stance kept the men alert but refused to waste ammunition on shadows. Before dawn, he had the patrol mounted again. They left the springs as gray light began to touch the tops of the hills, taking the recovered horses and the boy with them. On the return route, they saw ahead a group of riders near a wagon track, positioning themselves where they could strike at an approaching team. Stance responded immediately, swinging his men into line and pressing forward at a fast trot that opened into a run as they neared the ambush point. Once again, the sudden appearance of disciplined cavalry at close range shattered the raiders' plan. They scattered under the approach of the horses, and when the troopers opened fire with their repeaters at controlled intervals, the would-be attackers broke away from the road and withdrew into rougher ground. The wagons continued their movement with only a brief halt, drivers whipping their teams forward after understanding what had almost happened. Stance did not linger to talk. He kept his patrol moving, aware that repeated short clashes, each decided quickly and with controlled fire, wore down the raiders' will to stay close. Through all of these engagements, none of the troopers in Stance's patrol fell. Some horses carried new scars from near misses, and several men bore fresh bruises from hard riding and sudden turns over bad ground, but no one left the saddle permanently. The patrol returned to Fort McCavitt with the rescued boy, a string of animals that had been in enemy hands less than 2 days before, and a clear report of contacts in which they had taken the initiative and held it. Dust coated every surface of their uniforms and gear as they rode back through the gate, but their formation remained intact. On the parade ground, officers listened as Stance delivered his account. He described how the patrol had found the trail, engaged the raiding party near Kickapoo Springs, recovered part of the stolen herd, freed one of the kidnapped children, and then broken further attempts at ambush and theft during the return. His words were stripped of flourish, focused on distances, directions, and actions taken. But the pattern was clear. A small detachment of black cavalrymen had pushed into contested country, fought several brief fights without losing a man, and returned with both people and property saved from raiders. The story did not stay within the walls of the post. Soon ranchers who had lost animals or feared for their families heard that a 9th Cavalry sergeant and his men had brought one kidnapped boy back alive and reclaimed valuable stock. Word passed along wagon routes toward San Antonio and out to settlements scattered across the hill country. In towns where some men still spoke contemptuously of black troops, the quiet retelling of that scout began to change the tone. The nervous laughter that had greeted early reports of black cavalry on the frontier no longer came so easily, when listeners knew that those same men had charged armed raiders at close range and returned with their line unbroken. Within weeks, formal recognition followed. The Army reviewed Stance's actions on the Scout and approved the nation's highest military decoration in his name for gallantry on a field where only his men, the raiders, and one terrified child had seen the full reality of the fight. The medal officially acknowledged what the patrol's performance had already shown. The 9th Cavalry could send a black non-commissioned officer and a handful of troopers into dangerous ground and trust them to strike hard, hold their nerve, and come back with proof of their work. For outlaws, smugglers, and horse thieves who watched the frontier from the edges of saloons and remote camps, the message carried by that story mattered. The belief that black cavalrymen would hesitate or break under pressure fit their prejudice, but not the record now forming in reports and conversations. The men of Company F who had followed Sergeant Emmanuel Stance to Kickapoo Springs had shown a different reality, one where any party that underestimated a Buffalo Soldier patrol could find itself suddenly under disciplined fire in country it had once considered safe. From that spring day forward, the name of Stance and the regiment he served stood as one more warning that the United States cavalry on the frontier no longer looked or fought the way some scoffing men in distant rooms had imagined. July 26, 1877. Heat had already settled over Fort Concho before the sun cleared the low rise above the Concho River. Inside the limestone walls, the morning began with the usual calls, but that day the routine carried a sharp edge. Riders had come in the night from lonely camps to the west with news that a raiding party had struck deep into the stock country, seized horses from a herd guarded by cowboys, and vanished toward the vast flat tableland that Texans called the Staked Plains. The attackers had moved fast, leaving one man dead near a trampled bedroll and another badly wounded beside scattered cartridges in a stripped saddle. In the post headquarters, Captain Nicholas Nolan of the 10th Cavalry stood over a map that showed more blank space than detail. The Llano Estacado loomed as a pale, nearly featureless block across northwestern Texas. Few wells were marked. A handful of springs appeared as small dots near the edges. Officers knew that Comanche bands used that high country as a shield, crossing it between raids and vanishing where few white travelers could follow. The scouts who brought the first report said that this latest party had taken not only ranch stock but animals from stage and freighting outfits, good horses that the region could not easily spare. Nolan's orders came down in direct terms. Take a strong detachment of the 10th Cavalry, move onto the high plains, find the raiding party's trail, and recover the stolen animals if it could be done. Major Benjamin Grierson wanted pressure kept on any group that thought it could move unchallenged across that open ground, and the department headquarters expected results. Nolan understood the risk. Water on the Llano Estacado existed in scattered, uncertain pockets. A misjudged distance between sources meant thirst for men and horses, then collapse. Still, he accepted the assignment and began choosing the men who would ride with him. He took elements of 2 companies, drawing on troopers who had already shown steady conduct on earlier scouts. Black cavalrymen of the 10th moved quickly to their tasks. Saddles were checked, carefully tightened and checked again. Canvas water bags were filled until they sagged heavy on pack saddles and cantles. Each man carried a carbine, a revolver and a knife, along with cartridge belts that cut into his waist under the weight of ammunition. The supply detail loaded hardtack, bacon, and coffee into wagons, knowing that once the column left the river valleys behind, there would be nothing to buy or trade for on the empty highland. At the edge of the parade ground, officers from other units watched preparations with mixed expressions. Some admired the 10th's discipline and the calm way the men moved through their duties. Others muttered that sending any force that far onto the Staked Plains in midsummer was reckless. Among white civilians in the area, more than a few had said openly that black troopers would never endure such hardship, that they would falter the moment thirst or heat forced a choice between orders and survival. Those opinions did not slow the work in the stables. Horses were led out, eyes bright in the early light, ears flicking at the clank of chain and bit. Before the column left the fort, Nolan gave his officers clear instructions. They would aim for known water points marked on the map, a set of shallow lakes and ephemeral tanks where buffalo hunters and a few freighters had reported watering stock in past seasons. Between those points, the column needed to keep formation tight enough for control but loose enough to limit dust and allow horses to graze when possible. Scouts would ride ahead to pick up the raiders' trail and watch for fresh sign. If the stolen herd could be located near a water source, the cavalry would try to strike at dawn or dusk, when the animals and their guards were concentrated. The first day's march carried them west and north across rising ground, where short grass and scattered brush still offered forage. The sun climbed higher, flattening shadows. Behind the main body of riders, the faint green ribbon of the Concho Valley dwindled. By late afternoon, the column reached a line where the land seemed to level into a vast, slightly rolling tabletop. The air felt thinner and drier. A hot wind moved in steady gusts, pulling moisture from lips and skin. Dust from hooves drifted outward and then disappeared into the pale haze that lay over the horizon. They made camp that night at a shallow depression where earlier scouts had scraped enough water for a small party. Troopers dug with cups and bayonets to deepen the hole and coax up more moisture. Animals drank in turn, each horse given only a limited time at the muddy pool. Men filled their canteens last. Conversation around the small fires stayed close to practical matters, the condition of mounts, the direction of the tracks seen during the day, and the likely distance to the next water source. Stories of Comanches using the high plains as a refuge circulated quietly, but no one wasted breath on idle talk. Morning brought another start into open country. The trail of the raiding party often vanished on hard ground, only to reappear where animals had churned softer soil near low draws. Nolan's scouts reported that the tracks still led ahead, not turning away toward known reservation land or settled valleys. The raiders trusted the plains to shield them. As the second day wore on, the heat grew more intense. Sunlight beat on the backs of men and animals without shade. Sweat dried quickly into a stiff crust on uniforms. Lips cracked. Horses began to foam lightly at the bit. The water supply ran down faster than the officers had hoped. By late that afternoon, when the column expected to reach another reported waterhole, the scouts found only a dry basin baked into hard clay. The rains that had once filled it had ended weeks earlier. Cracked mud lay where shallow water should have stood. Nolan halted the column and studied the empty depression. Men who had counted on refilling canteens there shifted uneasily in their saddles, feeling the reduced weight of the containers at their sides. Horses flicked tongues over bits, seeking moisture. The captain had a choice. Turn back toward the concho and abandon the chase, or push on in the hope that another water source lay ahead within reach. He decided to continue. To retreat at that point would leave the raiding party free to reappear anywhere along the frontier with stolen horses and new confidence in its ability to outrun federal pursuit. Nolan ordered the column forward, instructing non-commissioned officers to impose tight discipline on water use. No trooper was to drink deeply unless explicitly told to do so. Animals would be allowed only brief rationed access to any small pockets of water discovered. The expected next source lay still ahead on the map, a cluster of lakes that buffalo hunters had described near the central stretch of the Llano Estacado. The third day turned harsh. By mid-morning, the canteens were nearly empty. The air over the plains took on a visible shimmer. The ground offered no shelter, only endless stretches of low, dry grass and patches of bare soil studded with pebbles. Boots raised fine dust that clung to faces and hands. Troopers' tongues felt thick. Conversation dropped away entirely. Men rode with eyes narrowed against the glare, focusing on the rumps of the horses ahead and the cues from sergeants who signaled small halts or changes in direction. As the hours passed, horses began to show serious strain. Some stumbled more often. A few stopped and refused to move until troopers dismounted, led them several paces, and coaxed them back into motion with quiet words and touches along their necks. The pack animals carrying the heaviest loads lagged and had to be urged forward with increasing effort. Nolan watched this with a tight jaw, knowing that if too many horses collapsed, the detachment would lose not only mobility but its ability to carry the recovered stock should it reach the raiders. By afternoon, the column entered a stretch where the horizon stood empty in every direction, a circle of land and sky without visible landmark. The high plains lived up to their reputation. There were no trees, no hills, no clear indication of distance covered. Only the steady rhythm of hooves marked the passage of miles. Men began to feel the first signs of serious dehydration, dull headaches, muscles cramping in legs that had been flexed over saddles for days, thoughts narrowing to the question of when and where the next drink might be found. Troopers who had heard white detractors claim that black soldiers lacked the constitution for hard campaigning now faced a test that few of those men could imagine. Discipline held. No one broke from the column to search for water on his own, even when the temptation must have been strong. The non-commissioned officers, themselves veterans of earlier scouts in Texas, moved among the ranks, checking on men who slumped in their saddles, speaking firm, clipped encouragement, adjusting strap and load where needed. Every action focused on keeping the formation intact and moving. Toward evening, a faint dark line appeared on the far horizon, a suggestion of low rises or brush. Hope rose quietly, not expressed in words but in the way men lifted their heads and leaned forward in their saddles. Nolan ordered the column to maintain pace. If water lay there, reaching it before full dark would mean survival. If not, the detachment would face a night on the open plains with almost nothing left in the canteens and animals reaching their limits. When the column arrived near the dark line, they found no flowing water. Only a series of shallow depressions ringed by dry reeds and scattered bones. Whatever rain had once collected there had long since baked away under weeks of sun. The dark smear on the horizon came from low scrub and the remnants of earlier campfires where other parties had once stopped, not from living water. Troopers looked down into the cracked basins with hollow expressions. Some knelt and scraped at the mud, searching for any sign of dampness. Their fingers came back coated only in powdery dust. At that moment, the risk of collapse became acute. Men were on the edge of heat exhaustion. Horses swayed on their feet. Nolan called his officers together and laid out the only workable plan. A smaller party would push ahead through the night toward the nearest recorded lakes, riding with the strongest horses and the most fit men, carrying as many empty canteens as they could manage. The rest of the detachment would move more slowly, keeping to a steady pace that would not kill the exhausted animals outright, and would attempt to hold position as best it could until water arrived. Volunteers for the forward group stepped up from the ranks. Many knew that the assignment meant riding into even greater uncertainty. They went anyway. As the sky darkened and stars pricked through, the advance party set off, hooves thudding softly on the dry ground. The main body settled into a rough bivouac without fires, men lying beside their horses, using saddles as pillows, rifles close at hand. The night air did little to cool the heat stored in the plains. Thirst denied sleep to most. Troopers shifted restlessly, lips moving in quiet prayers or simple counting to pass slow minutes. Sometime before dawn, the advance party found what they were looking for. A cluster of natural basins held murky water that smelled of animals and months of heat but remained liquid. It was enough. Men dropped to their knees to drink, but officers and sergeants held them back, insisting that water go first into the empty canteen so that the main column would not be left without. Horses were led in turn to the edges of the pools, given limited time to drink before being pulled, a way to prevent them from draining the basins completely. Loaded with as much water as the animals could carry, the forward group turned back at once. Their return march cut across the same featureless country, but now every mile carried not only men and horses, but the small possibility of survival for those waiting behind. When they reached the main detachment, they found troopers who could barely stand without help, and animals that hung their heads low, eyes dull. Canteens were handed out in a rough order, wounded and weakest first, then those who still had to ride and guard. No one drank all he wanted. Every swallow had to be measured against the remaining distance to safer ground. The detachment did not find the raiding party that had sparked the mission. The Comanches had used their knowledge of the terrain to slip away somewhere beyond the cavalry's reach, disappearing into the same vast spaces that had nearly broken the pursuers. But the 10th did not disintegrate. Under Nolan's command, the troopers turned their columns toward the southeast and began the slow movement back toward Fort Concho. guiding weakened horses carefully, halting often enough to prevent further losses and watching each other for signs of collapse. On the return march, graves were dug for men who had fallen. Some had died from heat and thirst during the worst hours before the forward party brought back water. Others never recovered from the damage done to their bodies by those days of exposure and strain. Those who survived carried the marks of the march in weight lost, skin burned and cracked, and a new understanding of what it meant to ride onto the staked plains in pursuit of an enemy who did not fear the empty distances. When the column finally rode back through the gates of Fort Concho, it moved more slowly than when it had left. Horses stepped carefully, ribs showing along their flanks. Troopers sat thinner in the saddle, uniforms hanging looser at the shoulders, eyes marked by fatigue. Yet their formation held. They brought back their weapons, their remaining animals, and the story of what it had taken to cross that dry, exposed land alive. Reports written afterward focused on losses and on questions about planning. But even critical observers admitted that the black cavalrymen of the 10th had shown a level of endurance that silenced casual mockery. Beyond the fort, news of the march spread through ranches, camps, and towns. Some buffalo hunters who had boasted that soldiers would never last on the llano listened more carefully when survivors of the patrol described walking beside collapsing horses, sharing the last drops of water among men without complaint, and waiting for relief in an environment that offered no shelter. Outlaws and stock thieves who had once taken comfort from the remoteness of the high plains now had to consider the possibility that a column of buffalo soldiers might appear behind them after all, having ridden across country that many white frontiersmen still called impassable. The Staked Plains Horror, as newspapers later labeled it, stood as a harsh example of what uncontrolled distances and scarce water could do. For the men of the 10th Cavalry who had lived through it, the event became something else as well. It was a measure of their own capacity to follow orders, maintain discipline, and push on when conditions stripped away every illusion about the nature of the land they served in. From that summer onward, doubts expressed in careless conversation about black cavalrymen's toughness sounded hollow to anyone who knew what had happened on the high tableland north of Fort Concho, where a detachment of buffalo soldiers had ridden until the plains themselves nearly killed them, and still brought most of their number home in formation. December 21st, 1877. Cold air lay over the lower Rio Grande Valley as a column of 9th Cavalry troopers moved along the road towards San Elizario, horses' breath showing in faint clouds and iron shoes striking a hard rhythm on frozen ground. The men rode in dark blue jackets buttoned tight, blankets rolled behind saddles, carbines slung where a hand could reach them fast. Ahead, somewhere beyond the next bend, stood a town that had seen Texas Rangers surrender at gunpoint and a county judge shot down, a place where local armed men now claimed authority and where rumor said no state or federal officer dared to show a badge. Colonel Edward Hatch rode near the front, eyes on the low buildings that began to lift out of the flat country as the column closed in. In the weeks before that march, San Elizario had been the center of a fight over salt and power that turned from court filings into open war. For generations, families on both sides of the border had driven carts and pack trains to the salt lakes near the Guadalupe Mountains to scrape the crust for food, trade, and mining. To them, the white crust on the dry lake beds was a shared resource, guaranteed by old Spanish and Mexican grants. When Anglo businessmen and their allies in county offices began filing claims that treated the salt as private property, demanding payment from men who had always collected it for free, meetings turned angry. Local Tejano leaders formed committees, held councils, and warned that they would not accept a system that stripped their control over something so basic. By autumn, the conflict had drawn in judges, politicians, and gunmen. A district judge, Charles Howard, took a key role on the side that pushed private ownership and fees. He used the law to challenge men hauling salt without his permission. Opponents seized him at San Elizario, held him for days, and forced him to sign away his claim before letting him go. Weeks later, he returned and shot his former ally, the influential Tejano leader Luis Cardis, in a store at El Paso. Blood on the floor of that building turned a bitter dispute into something more. Tejano residents of San Elizario and neighboring towns armed themselves and moved to shut down county government they saw as hostile. State officials answered by sending Frontier Battalion Rangers under Lieutenant John Taze to the valley. These Rangers brought a mix of experience and reputation, but they rode into a town where the majority of residents saw them as the armed wing of a political faction that had already tried to seize the salt. When Howard came back yet again with the Rangers at his side in early December, hundreds of local men surrounded the Ranger quarters. Shots were fired in narrow streets lined with adobe houses. Barricades went up. Taze and his company retreated into a fortified position and finally into the town church. After a siege that lasted 2 days, the Rangers surrendered, the only time in their history that a unit laid down its arms to an armed local force. Howard and 2 others were executed and dumped in a well. Many Anglo residents fled. San Elizario stood under the control of an insurgent movement that believed it had driven out state authority. By the time Hatch received orders in New Mexico, the situation had become a matter for federal attention. Reports reaching Army headquarters spoke of a county seat where the sheriff could not enforce warrants, where court officers had gone into hiding or crossed into Mexico, and where a local junta claimed the right to decide who entered and who left. The commander at Fort Bliss had seen his post effectively shut down. Washington did not want an open rebel enclave on a key border stretch, especially not one that had just forced state law officers to surrender. The 9th Cavalry was chosen for the job of restoring order and showing that the United States still held command on its own frontier. Hatch gathered 3 battalions of his regiment, men hardened by years of duty in New Mexico and along the Rio Grande. They had spent seasons escorting wagon trains, chasing raiding parties, and holding remote posts where water and supplies came only after long waits. Many had heard the way some white commentators spoke of the Salt War, painting the Tejano fighters as an uncontrolled mob and hinting that the state could not rely on black troops to face such a force. The troopers saddled their horses without comment. They packed rations, ammunition, and medical supplies into wagons and on pack animals, knowing the march would move fast and that any hesitation could let the conflict spread. The column left New Mexico and crossed into West Texas with a sheriff's posse of hired gunmen and volunteers from New Mexico riding alongside, men such as John Kinney's Silver City fighters who had their own reputations along the border. The 9th remained the core. Black troopers in line kept spacing tight, watching the flanks as they moved through country where mesquite and saltbush grew in clumps along the river and where the Rio Grande cut a shallow groove through cottonwood stands and low fields. Small settlements along the way watched the column pass, some residents stepping into doorways, some staying behind shutters. Word traveled ahead that regular cavalry was coming in strength. As Hatch's men approached San Elizario on that cold December day, they saw signs of the unrest before they reached the town's plaza. A burned house on the edge of the settlement stood with its roof fallen in, adobe walls stained dark by smoke. A few wagons lay overturned beside the road, axles broken, their cargo long gone. Dogs barked and then slipped away into alleys. The main street showed fewer people than such a place would normally hold. Those who remained outside watched the approaching column with guarded faces, hands near belts where knives or pistols might rest. Hatch halted the 9th just short of the central square and deployed companies with deliberate care. Troops peeled off to block key alleys and roads leading toward the river, their carbines plainly visible. Others formed a line across the street facing the plaza, the regiment's guidons lifting in the chill air. Officers rode out to make contact with whoever claimed authority now that the Rangers were gone. A translator accompanied them, ready to handle rapid Spanish. The message they carried was blunt. Federal troops were now in town. Any armed resistance would be met with force. Inside San Elizario, the leaders of the insurgent committees had to weigh options quickly. They had defeated a company of Rangers and humiliated a state judge, but the sight of multiple companies of regular cavalry with artillery support and experienced officers presented a different kind of opponent. Many of the men in the movement had families in the town and across the river. Some still hoped for negotiations that might restore old communal salt rights. Others saw the presence of the Ninth as the start of a crackdown that would strip them of remaining leverage. In homes near the plaza, men gathered weapons and made choices. Some slipped through back alleys and out toward the river, intending to cross into Mexico before the soldiers finished sealing the town. Others stayed but hid rifles and ammunition in walls, courtyards, and irrigation ditches, planning to wait for a better moment. A few came forward to talk, hoping to present themselves as community representatives rather than rebels. The quick departures confirmed what the army suspected. The Ninth's arrival had broken the confidence that had grown after the Ranger surrender. Hatch kept his men steady. Search details went from house to house, always accompanied by an officer or senior non-commissioned officer who could enforce discipline while still moving fast. Doors were knocked on, then entered. Rooms were checked for stacked rifles, ammunition boxes, and signs of recent barricades. In one former ranger post, troopers found bullet holes in adobe walls, spent cartridges scattered across the floor, and a corner where blood had dried in dark patches. A separate detail located the well where Howard and others had been thrown. The sight of that foul water confirmed for the cavalry the kind of violence that had already passed through the town. Federal authority returned first in the most basic form, armed men on corners. 9th Cavalry troopers took positions at key intersections, 2 or 3 at each point, watching the movement of people and wagons. They stood in uniforms that marked them as black soldiers of the United States, boots planted, carbines at ready arms. Some townspeople stared with a mix of resentment and fear. Others, especially a few Anglo merchants who had remained, saw in those pickets a level of control that had been missing since the summer. Within days, Hatch and his officers ordered the re-establishment of Fort Bliss in a position that would allow the army to oversee both San Elizario and the broader El Paso Valley. The post gave the 9th a base from which to patrol roads, guard crossings, and respond quickly to any sign that armed resistance might gather again. Black cavalrymen built and repaired structures, set up corrals, and laid out the drill field, the routine work of turning a patch of land into a functioning fort. Their presence on that ground sent a clear message. The federal government intended to keep a permanent set of eyes and rifles on the border. Patrols began at once. Small detachments rode out along the routes leading from San Elizario to Socorro, Isleta, and north toward Franklin and other settlements. They checked for armed groups moving between villages, questioned suspicious riders, and watched the crossings where the Rio Grande could be forded in winter. Some of these patrols encountered men they knew had been part of the earlier fighting. Without enough evidence to tie individuals to specific killings, the 9th often could not make formal arrests, but the troopers did not ignore them. A habit of sudden questioning and inspection replaced open defiance. Along the Rio Grande at night, the regiment's campfires glowed in neat lines. Guards walked post with rifles held close against the cold, boots crunching on frost. In the small hours when the town lay mostly silent, the sentries heard sounds from across the river. The faint movements of refugees who had crossed to Mexican soil with their families to avoid facing warrants and trials. Some of those men had once laughed aloud at the idea of black cavalry units imposing order in their valley. repeating old prejudices about soldiers they had never seen. Now they watched the picket lines from a distance they dared not cross. United States marshals and state officials returned under the protection of the Ninth. Court sessions restarted, when sheriffs and deputies went to serve writs or seize property for unpaid judgments. Buffalo soldiers rode with them. On several occasions, groups of men gathered to shout at the officers or crowd them in narrow streets. Each time, presence of calm, disciplined troopers with steady hands on rifle stocks and revolver butts discouraged any move toward a second siege. The memory of Rangers forced to surrender still moved through conversations in the county, but facing multiple companies of 9th Cavalry with artillery behind them felt different even to hard men. Arrests connected to the Salt War went forward selectively. Some prominent leaders of the revolt had already crossed into Mexico and did not return. Others stayed and faced indictment or civil actions. The process was messy. Juries could be reluctant. Local feelings did not disappear simply because soldiers stood in the plaza. Yet the overarching pattern was clear. The days when a county judge could be run out of office and a ranger company penned up in a church without swift federal reaction were over, because the Ninth now stood, ready to ride at short notice with enough force to prevent such actions from reaching that stage again. For the 9th Cavalry troopers on the ground, the assignment combined routine garrison work with periods of tension. They drilled in the morning, practicing mounted formations in the dusty parade area of the rebuilt fort. They stood watch over arrested men awaiting proceedings in town. They escorted supply trains along the river and out to more distant posts. They answered alarms from ranches that claimed raids or threats, sometimes finding nothing more than disputes between neighbors, sometimes uncovering caches of weapons and stolen stock. Every week of continuous presence chipped away at the space in which organized armed resistance could operate. Among men who ran contraband, rustled cattle, or robbed along the border, the perception of black cavalrymen changed. Early talk in saloons and camps had treated Buffalo soldiers as untested, as men who might be brave in stories but would not stand up under complex political fighting or in close urban quarters. The performance of the 9th in San Elizario and its surroundings showed something else. The regiment had marched quickly into a volatile environment, confronted an armed population in a tight town, and imposed steady control without losing cohesion or discipline. That set of skills mattered as much to professional criminals as it did to politicians in Austin and Washington. Over the next months, San Elizario's importance faded. The county seat moved to El Paso, closer to rail lines and to Anglo business interests that now had firmer control. The town that had once led the valley declined. Many Tejano families remained, working land and running small businesses, but their political power shrank. Above them, Fort Bliss grew in significance as a base for army operations along the border. When officers wrote histories of the 9th Cavalry's service years later, they noted the Salt War as one of the regiment's actions, a point where their march into a rebellious town ended an insurrection that had humiliated state forces. For the men who had tightened saddle cinches on that cold December morning and ridden into San Elizario, the memory stayed sharper than any line in an official summary. They had seen bullet-scarred walls where Rangers had made their final stand, the well that had held the bodies of a judge and others, and the faces of residents who weighed defiance against the sight of black troopers posted at every key corner. In that place, in that winter, the 9th Cavalry had shown not only the ability to fight on distant plains, but the capacity to bring a town under control after state authority had failed. The outlaws and political fighters who had laughed at the idea of black cavalry enforcing order now had to reckon with what had actually happened. When news of the regiment's march spread up and down the valley and into distant camps, it carried a clear lesson. A unit that had been mocked as an experiment, one that many expected to falter if confronted with a determined local uprising, had instead ridden in, locked down a county seat, reopened a major fort, and held the line until civil structures could function again. On the harsh border where law shifted with river floods and faction fights, the 9th Cavalry's performance during the Salt War marked them as a force that neither insurgents nor outlaws could afford to dismiss. February 18, 1878. Cold winds swept down off the Sacramento Mountains into Fort Stanton, cutting through wool jackets and rattling loose shutters along the row of officers' quarters. Snow lay in old, dirty patches on north-facing slopes, and the Rio Bonito ran dark between thin ice along its banks. In the parade ground's packed dirt, 9th Cavalry horses stamped and snorted while troopers moved between corrals and stables. Inside the post headquarters, an orderly stepped in from the telegraph room with a folded message and handed it to the officer in charge. The wire from Lincoln reported that John Tunstall, an English rancher and merchant, had been shot that afternoon on the road while driving a small herd of horses, killed by a posse sworn in under the authority of Sheriff William Brady. Word moved quickly from the office to the barracks and stables. Men of the 9th had heard the names already. Tunstall ran a store and ranching outfit that challenged the long dominant firm of Lawrence Murphy and James Dolan, whose house in Lincoln controlled credit, supplies, and contracts for years. Their rivalry had turned increasingly hostile. Ranch hands had traded threats in saloons. Charges and countercharges of cattle theft filled the talk around campfires. Tunstall's death meant that what had been a tense business struggle and a legal feud had crossed fully into killing. To reach the dead man and his hands in time, the 9th would have needed to be on the road before dawn. Now the question was what they would do next in a county that had just tipped into open war. Fort Stanton sat only a short ride from Lincoln, its whitewashed walls and stone buildings looking down on the Bonito Valley. The garrison housed infantry as well as 9th Cavalry companies. Until that winter, their duty in the area focused on escorting supply trains, watching Mescalero Apache movements to the south, and responding to scattered rustling complaints. They knew about cattle thieves who ran stock through narrow canyons at night, branding over existing marks, and about rough young cowhands who hired on as muscle for whichever rancher paid them. Those patterns had become more organized since the arrival of Dolan's hired gunmen, including the Jesse Evans outfit and Seven Rivers Cowboys, men who rode under loose law but close to the courthouse and sheriff's office. In the days after Tunstall's killing, the fort's routine shifted. Patrol orders that had once listed only remote canyons and pasture lands began to include the town of Lincoln itself. The first time a significant detachment of Buffalo soldiers rode down the valley toward the county seat. In that tense period, the town felt different from the scattered Mexican villages and Texas hamlets they had known. Lincoln stretched along a single dirt road hemmed in by adobe buildings on both sides, the hill rising at one end, and the river not far away. The main store of Murphy and Dolan stood on one side, its long porch facing the street. Across and down the road, the smaller store and offices connected to Tunstall and his lawyer partner, Alexander McSween, looked freshly shuttered, their owner newly dead. As the 9th's detachment approached, townspeople stepped back to doorways and windows. Some men wore pistols openly on their belts, jackets hanging loose enough to clear the holsters. A few leaned against porch posts, watching the column with narrowed eyes. The cavalrymen rode in two files, carbines in boots, revolvers at their hips, hats pulled down against the wind. They halted near the center of town at a signal from the lieutenant in charge and sat quietly while the officer dismounted and walked to speak with the justice of the peace and other officials willing to show their faces. Behind him, black troopers of the 9th waited without shifting in the saddle, their presence alone a sharp contrast to the scattered civilians with rifles at windows or leaning against walls. In side rooms and back tables of saloons, some of the county's hired gunmen laughed when they heard that Colored cavalry had ridden through the street. They told each other that these troopers might escort supply wagons and chase a few Indians, but would not wade into a fight between serious cattle outfits. Not when both sides were white and well-connected. Men from the Jesse Evans crew, Seven Rivers warriors, and other loose riders boasted that they had fought in harsher conditions than anything the Ninth had seen. A few recalled stories about black regulars in Texas and dismissed them as luck or exaggeration. They counted on the complexity of the situation, with sheriffs, judges, and big ranchers entangled, to keep the army hesitant. At Fort Stanton, the written instructions that reached 9th Cavalry officers walked a narrow line. The Army did not claim direct authority over local criminal cases, but federal regulations required soldiers to support civil officers when called upon and to protect government property and employees. Given the state of Lincoln County, that meant the 9th now had to be ready to escort deputies, guard prisoners, and intervene if armed men tried to overrun the courthouse or cut stage routes. The troopers were told to remain neutral in the business feud, to take orders only from military and federal channels, and to treat any armed band outside regular law as subject to being disarmed and detained. The first real test came when a mixed group of deputies and civilians requested an escort to move a prisoner from Lincoln to Fort Stanton's guardhouse, while the county jail remained exposed. The prisoner had ties to one of the cattle factions and friends in both the town and ranch camps nearby. News of the planned transfer spread quickly. On the morning of the move, a 9th Cavalry squad stood ready in the fort's yard, checking saddles and weapons. They rode out with an empty wagon between them, the rough stockade. The frame built over its bed, ready for a man who might otherwise disappear into a lynching tree. When they reached Lincoln and drew up near the jail, the street held more men than usual. Knots of onlookers loitered near the boardwalk, hands resting on rifle barrels or hanging near gun belts. Some called out taunts at the black troopers, testing for reaction. The soldiers ignored the words and focused on their tasks. At the lieutenant's order, 4 men dismounted and formed a walking guard around the prisoner as he was brought out, irons clinking against his wrists. The rest stayed mounted, facing outward, ready to meet any rush toward the wagon. For a moment, tension peaked. A small crowd edged closer, faces tight, anger fueled by whiskey, loyalty, or paid promises. One man pushed forward enough that his coat brushed the flank of a cavalry horse. The trooper on that mount turned his head, looked directly at him, and shifted his carbine slightly. Not as a threat, but as a clear reminder that the weapon was there and under control. The line of black horsemen did not move back or break. The lieutenant gave a quiet order, and the dismounted guard walked the prisoner to the wagon, loaded him inside, and climbed onto the tailboard. The driver slapped the reins and the little convoy began rolling back toward Fort Stanton, the escort maintaining formation the entire way. The incident produced no grand gunfight, but in a county where prisoners had often been killed on lonely roads or snatched from local jails by masked men, the sight of a guarded black cavalry escort that could not be bluffed or shoved aside made an impression. Men who had joked that these troopers would never stand firm in the face of an angry crowd now had to live with the memory of a narrow street lined with rifles and pistols that still did not budge the line of mounted soldiers. In saloons that night, talk about the 9th lost some of its careless laughter. Beyond the town itself, the 9th's role deepened as the winter wore on. Cattle theft remained the currency of power in Lincoln County. Herds grazed on open range, often unmarked by fences. Brand disputes were settled unofficially by whoever had more guns. The strongest outfits used hired fighters to appropriate rivals' stock under cover of darkness or under the pretense of legal seizure. Threads of that trade ran through canyons, arroyos, and wooded slopes that the 9th now began to patrol. One late afternoon, a patrol under a 9th Cavalry sergeant followed a set of fresh tracks leading out of the Bonito Valley into rough country north of the town. The sign showed a small herd driven fast with shod horses alongside, some prints overlapping the brands of known ranches. The patrol moved in file along a narrow wash, then fanned out when the ground broadened and brush thinned. Shadows stretched long as the sun slid behind the ridge. Near a bend in the arroyo, the troopers saw a dust cloud ahead and heard the sharp yells of men pushing animals. The sergeant raised his hand, and the patrol broke into a trot. They came around the curve and found a group of riders trying to move a cluster of cattle up a low bank toward a side draw. The brands on the animals' flanks did not match the outfit names the riders shouted when challenged. The men's coats and hats bore the look of range hands, but several carried rifles in ways that suggested more practice in ambush than in herding. The sergeant called out an order to halt and demanded that the riders identify themselves and justify moving those particular cattle. One of the cowboys answered with a curse and kept his horse pushing against the herd. Another laughed loudly and told the troopers that the animals were being taken under proper authority. Waving a folded paper he did not bother to unfold far enough for anyone to read. His eyes ran over the patrol, lingering on the troopers' faces, and he added a remark about cavalry boys who did not understand real ranch work. The 9th's response was simple. Carbines came up, not fired but brought to the ready. The sergeant repeated his demand, this time adding that any rider who tried to move an animal before matters were cleared up would be treated as attempting theft in the presence of federal troops. The patrol edged their mounts to form a line between the riders and the direction of travel. The cattle, confused by the sudden barrier, slowed and began to mill. The would-be drovers now found themselves staring at a row of steady muzzles and unblinking eyes. Warriors and outlaws elsewhere might have tested that line. These men, who relied on reputation as much as on actual gun work, decided that a carbine round to the chest was not worth a few head of stolen stock. After a long moment, the rider holding the paper folded it up again and slid it inside his coat. He muttered something about confusion over brands and gave a signal with his hand. One by one, the group turned their horses away, leaving the herd for the patrol to control. The troopers did not lower their weapons until the last of the riders disappeared behind the ridge. Then they set about collecting the cattle and driving them back toward a ranch whose mark they recognized, delivering both animals and a detailed report about the intercepted attempt. In the weeks that followed, similar incidents built a pattern. The 9th escorted federal agents serving writs related to land and cattle claims. They appeared without warning along trails where riders believed themselves safe, checking brands and bills of sale without backing down from men whose names carried weight in court and saloon. Lincoln's crooked cattle war depended on intimidation, on the idea that anyone who stood in the way of a seizure or a forced sale would face unanswerable force. The presence of Buffalo soldiers who answered only to their officers and to federal instructions made that intimidation less certain. Inside the town, tensions kept climbing. Supporters of McSween and allies of Dolan watched each other from opposite porches. Men drifted in and out of the area with rifles wrapped in blankets and pistols under coats. Every fresh killing pushed the factions closer to open battle. In that simmering environment, the 9th continued its round of visible patrols and quiet escorts. Troopers were seen riding at the side of deputy marshals one day, then posted near the courthouse the next, then returning to Fort Stanton for fresh orders and supplies. Some of the outlaws who worked as hired guns for the cattle interests still claimed that the 9th would only go so far. In their talks around back tables, they argued that these soldiers might handle escorts and minor confrontations, but would not stand in the middle of a full firefight between dozens of men. They took comfort in the fact that the troopers stayed mostly under direction of higher officers and did not yet step directly into the crossfire of the feud. Their confidence would be tested sooner than they believed. For the Buffalo Soldiers, February 1878 marked the moment when Lincoln County stopped being just another stretch of New Mexico range and became a place where law, business, and raw firepower collided in tight spaces. The Ninth did not choose the sides in that fight, but their entry put a new weight on the scale. Each calm line held in a narrow street, each herd turned back from theft under the stare of carbine muzzles, and each prisoner escorted through hostile crowds without a shot fired, began to alter how the county's gunmen measured risk. They had watched these black cavalrymen ride in from Fort Stanton and assumed they would stay on the margins. Instead, day by day, the Ninth pushed themselves deeper into the crooked war taking shape, preparing without full knowledge for the larger clashes that would soon turn Lincoln's single street into a battlefield. February 21st, 1878. Cold air settled along the Rio Bonito as a single rider came up the road toward Fort Stanton, horse's nose white with frost where breath had frozen on the hair. The post lay on a rise above the valley, a row of whitewashed buildings facing an open parade ground and the dark line of the riverbank trees. Smoke from chimneys rose straight up in the still morning. Ninth Cavalry horses stood in their corrals with rime on their backs, heads low, waiting for feed. Inside the headquarters building, Captain George Purington bent over a desk stacked with papers when an orderly stepped in and announced that Deputy United States Marshal Robert Wiedenman had arrived from Lincoln and requested an immediate interview. Wiedenman stepped into the heated room with his hat tucked under one arm, wool coat dusted with road grit and a faint trace of dried mud along the hem. He carried himself stiffly, not from the ride alone, but from the strain of the days since his friend John Tunstall had gone into the ground. The killing at the Fela's ranch hung over every word in Lincoln County, but he did not waste time repeating what Purington already knew. He laid his commission papers on the desk, the document that gave him federal authority, and said in a flat voice that members of the Jesse Evans outfit and their associates had taken government mules from the Mescalero agency, stock-marked with the letters of the United States. Those animals, he said, were somewhere in the hands of men who believed county power protected them. Purington listened, jaw tight, eyes moving from the papers to the man who held them. The captain already understood how tangled Lincoln County had become. Sheriff William Brady and the Murphy and Dolan crowd claimed the law on their side. Tunstall and McSween had their own warrants and allies. Rustling and seizure rode in the same saddles as court orders. Wiedenman's request cut through that tangle in one way. Stealing federal mules gave the Army an undisputed interest. The deputy marshal wanted soldiers not to march under local writs, but to support him as a federal officer serving his own process. That distinction mattered to a regular officer trying to keep clear lines in a messy civilian conflict. After a long moment, Purington said he would provide a detachment of 9th Cavalry under one of his lieutenants within a short time. The troopers would answer to their own chain of command but would escort the deputy marshal as he carried out his duty. Wiedenman's shoulders eased slightly. He had been walked to jail at Brady's order once already when he protested a seizure at the Tunstall store. He did not intend to step alone into Dolan's stronghold again. Leaving the papers on the desk, he gripped the captain's hand briefly, then stepped back into the cold light outside to wait while the arrangements were made. Word of the planned escort reached the 9th's barracks within the hour. Men sat on rough wooden bunks under the low roofs, kerosene lamps casting yellow light on dark wool jackets and polished brass. When the first sergeant read out the detail, eyes turned his way. A lieutenant from the infantry could look at Lincoln County and see another political fight between white men. For black troopers of the 9th, the talk of stolen government mules and a gang that mocked both local law and the United States meant something they recognized. They had faced rustlers and border thieves in Texas, men who laughed at any badge until they saw cavalry carbines pointed their way. Now the same pattern showed itself up the valley. The chosen detachment began checking gear immediately. In the tack room, troopers ran fingers along saddle rigging to make sure no worn strap would give way in the middle of a tense street. They rubbed frost from bits, oiled stiff leather reins, and tightened cinches over wool blankets laid on horses' backs. In the armory corner, men broke open carbines, wiped chambers with oiled cloth, and worked levers until the actions moved smoothly. Revolvers came out of holsters for inspection, cylinders turning under calloused thumbs as each chamber was checked for a clean bore and a fresh cartridge. Cartridge belts were laid out on bunks and filled until each loop held a round. Outside, 9th Cavalry horses stood tied to the picket line, steam curling from their nostrils as troopers brushed ice-crusted hair from their necks and flanks. Hooves were picked and checked for loose shoes. The animals tossed their heads, ears flicking at the sound of men talking quietly and metal clinking. A few older mounts had scars from earlier scouts, white marks where cinches had rubbed or where brush had cut skin. The men who would ride them knew those marks as well as they knew the calluses on their own hands. 2 days later, before full light had reached the high slopes to the south, Lieutenant Millard Goodwin rode out at the head of the detachment. Wiedemann rode near him, wrapped in a darker coat but with the star of his deputy marshal's badge visible under the lapel. Behind them came 9th Cavalry troopers in column, carbines slung at the right, revolvers on hips, bedrolls tied behind saddles. The breath of men and horses hung in the air as they crossed the frozen ground beyond the fort and dropped into the valley road that led toward Lincoln. The ride down the Bonito that morning passed fields edged by low fences and adobe houses with smoke rising from short chimneys. Families who had buried their dead recently stepped to doorways as the column went by, eyes following the deputy marshal and the black soldiers beside him. Some made the sign of the cross. Others simply watched, hands deep in coat pockets. Farther along the road, cowhands from small ranches paused on their way to check stock, leaning on saddle horns as they took in the sight of federal cavalry heading straight toward the county seat with a United States officer at their side. Lincoln lay stretched along the single road as it had on earlier visits, but the air around it felt more charged. On one end, the long adobe of the Murphy and Dolan store, called the house, faced the street with a deep porch and narrow windows. At the other, the Tunstall and McSween store and offices stood nearer the river, doors shut tight. The gap between those buildings, lined with smaller homes, sheds, and corrals, had become a corridor where nearly every adult male carried a weapon as a matter of course. On that February morning, word of the approaching column rippled along the street before the first horse reached town. Goodwin brought the 9th to a halt outside the house. Troopers swung down from their saddles at his order, boots hitting the packed earth in almost unison. They led their horses to positions that formed a loose horseshoe around the front and sides of the long store, leaving room for people to pass but clearly marking that the building stood under watch. A few men remained mounted at either end of the line, watching alleys that ran down to the river and up toward the low hill behind the town. Inside the store and in the rooms upstairs, men linked to the Dolan faction watched the soldiers through narrow panes of glass. Some of them were members of the Evans outfit or had ridden with Seven Rivers men in earlier raids. They were used to seeing county deputies at their side, not federal troopers standing outside their doors. Rough comments circulated quickly. A few voices laughed about niggers in blue sent to tell them what to do in their own town. The sound of that laughter reached the street faintly when a door opened and closed again. Wiedemann did not approach alone. He walked forward with Goodwin on one side and a 9th Cavalry sergeant on the other. The deputy marshal's badge clipped to his coat front, papers tucked in his hand. When he reached the doorway, he called out the names of Jesse Evans, Frank Baker, Tom Hill, and George Davis, stating clearly that he held warrants for their arrest on charges tied to stolen government stock. His voice carried along the porch and into the rooms beyond. The soldiers behind him stood without shifting, each man keeping his assigned sector under watch. No target stepped into the doorway. A store clerk appeared instead, eyes sliding past the black troopers to focus on the lieutenant and the marshal. He claimed that Evans and his close companions were not inside, that they had ridden out days earlier. When pressed, he offered no details about where they had gone. There were armed men upstairs, but none who would answer to the names on the federal papers. The clerk spoke with the confident tone of someone who believed the House could decide whom to admit and whom to reject, no matter who waited outside. Goodwin and Wideman made the decision to search rather than accept those words. With the lieutenant's approval, a small group of troopers entered the building. Under the deputy marshal's authority, weapons kept at the low ready. They moved quickly through the ground floor, past stacked goods and barrels, then up narrow stairs to check sleeping rooms and storerooms. Men they found inside submitted to brief questioning and searches with sullen expressions and hostile eyes. But no one matched the descriptions of the gang members named on the warrants. The suspected thieves had slipped away before dawn or had never been there at all. The escort did not give up after that first disappointment. Reports had come in that Brady's deputies had been camped on Tunstall property, enforcing attachments and using the seized store as a strong point. Evidence of stolen government animals or their handlers might lie there instead. With the soldiers back in position, Goodwin and Wideman moved the column down the street toward the other end of town. 9th Cavalry troopers fell in with them, boots striking the packed dirt in time with the horses' hooves. Residents pulled children and livestock out of the way as the line went by. At the Tunstall store, guards posted by Brady stood near the doorway and along the side yard, rifles in hand. They wore the look of men who believed themselves backed by the full weight of county authority. When they saw the deputy marshal and the 9th approaching, they squared their shoulders and shifted their grips on their weapons. One called out that this property lay under lawful attachment and that no one would enter without the sheriff's approval. The words came in a sharp voice, meant to carry over the distance and to show everyone watching that county power still counted. Wideman answered with the language of his own commission. He stated that he held federal authority, that the theft of government mules constituted a crime beyond county lines, and that the guards would lower their weapons and submit to arrest while the property and surrounding stock were examined. The men at the door hesitated, glancing past him at the black soldiers spreading out along the street. The 9th formed a shallow arc again, a living barrier between the guards and any sudden influx of Dolan loyalists from the house. Carbines stayed pointed down but ready to come up in an instant. One guard spat on the ground and cursed the idea of a deputy marshal using colored troopers to bully county officers. He shifted his rifle as if to bring it across his chest. In response, the sergeant at Goodwin's side raised his voice once with no trace of hesitation, telling the guards that any man who pointed a weapon at federal soldiers would be treated as an armed suspect and disarmed by force. The troopers along the line adjusted their stance, a subtle movement that made metal fittings glint in the weak winter light. The standoff broke not with a shot, but with a series of small surrenders. One by one, Brady's guards realized that no posse of their own stood close enough to back a fight, not against disciplined soldiers ready to fire in controlled volleys. Slowly, they lowered their rifles. Troopers stepped in and took the weapons, moving with practiced efficiency. Belts with cartridge loops followed. Within minutes, the men who had blocked the doorway stood with empty hands, watched by 9th Cavalry privates whose faces showed no trace of the insults they had just heard. Wideman ordered the disarmed guards taken into custody pending charges connected to interference with a federal investigation. 9th troopers formed a small escort around the prisoners and marched them back up the street toward the waiting horses. Townspeople watched from porches and windows, taking in the sight of Brady's men being led away under guard by black soldiers. In a valley where many white men still mocked the idea of black regulars as a serious force, that image carried weight that no speech could match. Later that day, the escort moved away from Lincoln with the prisoners, heading back toward Fort Stanton. The winter light slanted low as they rode, hooves thudding on the hardening road, wagon wheels creaking where one vehicle carried extra gear. 9th Cavalry troopers rode on either side and behind the small column, weapons held where they could be brought into use at a moment's notice. The disarmed guards sat stiffly in the saddle or on the wagon bench, faces set, forced for once to feel the pressure that others in the county had long lived under. At the fort, the prisoners were turned over to the post guardhouse. Iron slammed shut behind them, the clank echoing along stone walls. Troopers returned saddles to racks, unbuckled belts, and washed dust from their hands and faces. They had followed orders back to federal officer and brought back men who had assumed they could hide behind the sheriff's badge. Talk in the barracks that evening stayed mostly practical about the mood in Lincoln and the likelihood that Brady would not leave matters there. The men did not expect thanks from the county, but they understood the message their presence had sent. Brady responded as expected. Offended that his deputies had been seized, he swore out complaints charging Weidenman and those who had accompanied him with rioting and unlawful arrest. Backed by his own posse and by the same power structure that had long favored the House, he moved to reassert control. Within days, legal papers began to circle. Men who had ridden with the deputy marshal and the 9th found themselves named as defendants in county proceedings even as they held warrants of their own. Military officers at Fort Stanton had to balance their support for the marshal with regulations that required them to respect civil process. When Brady's people arrived with documents in order, 9th Cavalry troopers could not simply bar the gate. They watched as men they had escorted into town, including the deputy marshal himself on one occasion, were placed under arrest by county authority and led away under guard. The soldiers remained at their posts, keeping discipline even as they saw local power twist the law back against those who had tried to enforce it. Among the hired guns who drifted through saloons and ranch camps, the story of those days did not focus on the later court maneuvers. It focused on the morning when 9th Cavalry troopers, black soldiers from Fort Stanton, had encircled the house, moved to the Tunstall store, and disarmed Brady's guards for all Lincoln to see. Men in the Evans outfit who had long joked about colored troopers as little more than showpieces heard that the guards had backed down under their stare. They heard that the house itself had been searched under the authority of a deputy marshal flanked by buffalo soldiers. For the 9th, the February escort marked another step into the heart of the Lincoln County struggle. They had not come to pick a business side between Dolan and McSween, but they had moved at the call of a federal officer against a gang accused of stealing stock that belonged to the United States. In doing so, they showed that their carbines and steady formation could reach into a crooked county seat just as surely as they could cross a hard trail. Outlaws who had once treated them as a distant rumor now had to include them in their calculations, weighing each move not only against local lawmen, but against black cavalrymen who had already demonstrated that under federal orders they would march straight up a hostile street, face a circle of guns, and act without flinching. July 18th, 1878. The sound of distant gunfire reached Fort Stanton in uneven bursts that morning, faint cracks rolling down the valley from the direction of Lincoln. At the post, men of the 9th Cavalry led horses to water, checked gear, and tried to ignore the sharp reports echoing over the hills. The fighting in the town had already gone on for days, a running clash between the Murphy and Dolan forces on one side and the regulators tied to Alexander McSween on the other. Reports coming in from couriers and frightened families all said the same thing. Lincoln's single street had become a shooting ground, and stray rounds were already hitting houses that held women and children. Inside the headquarters building at Fort Stanton, Lieutenant Colonel Nathan Dudley read the latest message from Lincoln with a hard expression. The note spoke of continuous firing, of men pinned down in adobe buildings along the road, and of at least one soldier wounded while on a civil errand in the town. It carried a request from citizens who claimed they could not step into the street without risking death. Dudley knew the new law that restricted the army from acting directly in local disputes, but he also knew that the post held the only organized force in the area capable of stopping a full-scale massacre if the firefight spread. He made his decision in minutes. Troops would march. Orders moved down through the garrison quickly. A detachment of cavalry, including Buffalo soldiers of the 9th, would go under Dudley's personal command. A section of light artillery would accompany them, one howitzer and a Gatling gun, with enough ammunition to fire for hours if needed. Infantrymen prepared to fall in alongside the mounted men, ready to move on foot once they reached the town. In the 9th's stables, troopers tightened cinches, secured saddlebags, and checked curb chains. Limber drivers harnessed teams to the gun carriages. Ammunition chests were closed and strapped down until the metal bands creaked. Buffalo soldiers moved methodically through their tasks. They had already ridden into Lincoln that winter to escort prisoners and back a deputy marshal, and they had seen how quickly contempt for black regulars could turn into grudging silence when carbines and steady eyes appeared in the street. This time the stakes were higher. The word came down plain. The town had been trading rifle shots for days. Houses were holed. No one from Lincoln could say how many men lay wounded and bleeding behind adobe walls. The soldiers would go in under orders to protect non-combatants and restore some kind of order before the entire place burned. By late morning, the column set out. Cavalry rode in front, mounted infantry behind, artillery pieces and caissons in the center where their wheels could follow the road. Dust rose under iron and hoof. The Bonito Valley lay quiet around them, fields and pastures empty of anyone who did not have to be outside. At scattered houses along the route, families watched the troops pass with strained faces, some stepping out far enough that Dudley could see their eyes. A few called out pleas to save relatives trapped in the town. Others simply stood and followed the movement with their gaze until the vehicles disappeared behind bends in the road. The closer the column came to Lincoln, the more obvious the trouble became. Smoke from scattered cooking fires mixed with a gray haze that hung above the town from days of burned powder and smoldering brush. As the leading troopers neared the first houses at the edge of the settlement, a bullet snapped overhead and struck a stone in the roadside bank, sending a chip whistling away. The shot had not been aimed at the soldiers. It came from someone firing at a target farther down the street, but it served as a clear reminder that the town lay fully engaged. Dudley halted the column just short of the main cluster of buildings and surveyed the scene through field glasses. He saw men moving behind low walls and around corners, heads ducking quickly between shots. The long adobe structure that housed the Murphy and Dolan store sat on one side of the street, pocked by fresh marks where bullets had chewed into plaster. Farther along, the McSween residence and its outbuildings formed another strong point, windows dark, doors barred, rifle barrels jutting from the shadows. Other smaller houses and sheds sheltered gunmen on both sides, turning every doorway into a possible muzzle. He issued crisp instructions. Infantry would deploy into skirmish lines on either side of the road, staying low and using buildings for cover. The 9th Cavalry troopers would dismount and hold the horses in protected positions behind the first rank of structures, then move forward on foot to act as mobile reserve and to cover the artillery. The guns would be positioned where they could command the street without being easily flanked. The troops were to avoid firing unless fired on directly, but they were to move into the town in a way that made it clear the United States Army was now present in force. Buffalo soldiers of the 9th stepped down from their saddles and handed reins to designated horse holders. Carbines came free from scabbards. Revolvers hung ready at belts. When the order came, they advanced in pairs along fence lines and irrigation ditches, boots sinking into dust stamped hard by days of movement. They moved past houses where curtains were drawn tight and doors were barred, past wells with broken buckets lying on their sides, and past a wagon whose sideboards had been pierced in multiple places by rifle fire. Through open gaps they caught glimpses of bodies lying where they had fallen, some covered hastily with blankets or coats, others left as they had dropped when the first shots had begun days earlier. At the edge of the main street, the 9th formed a visible line on both sides of the road, dark blue coats standing out against the sun-bleached adobe. Dudley rode forward and halted where he could be seen from both factions' positions. He sent a messenger under flag to both sets of gunmen with the same message. The army was on the ground. Civilians would be allowed to leave. Anyone trying to move under arms in the open would be treated as a threat to public safety. There would be no more firing at houses that held families. The response from the Murphy and Dolan side was cautious. Men linked to their faction eased back from windows and parapets, keeping weapons close but pausing to see what the troops would do. On the McSween side, the regulators held their positions, unsure whether the soldiers had come to disarm everyone or to favor one camp. For them, the sight of Dudley himself in town stirred suspicion. Some already believed he leaned toward the house because of earlier interactions. The first clear action of the detachment made its purpose obvious to the people trapped between the fighters. Buffalo soldiers and infantrymen stepped into the street in small groups to escort non-combatants out of the immediate line of fire. An older woman clutching a child's hand left a doorway on Dudley's order and crossed to the safer side of the road with a 9th Cavalry private walking between her and the direction of incoming shots. A man carrying a wounded relative over his shoulder staggered toward the troopers, and a pair of soldiers helped him clear the worst of the danger. One of them moved backward, facing the direction of the house to watch for any renewed firing, while the other steadied the injured man's load. As these evacuations unfolded, sporadic gunfire still cracked from corners and rooftops. Some men in the Murphy and Dolan lines used the confusion to shift along the street, taking new positions closer to the McSween house. Dudley's officers saw this movement and sent Buffalo soldiers to block some of the alleys they tried to use. Troopers took control of key junctions, making it difficult for any group from either camp to maneuver freely. Their presence did not entirely stop the adjustments, but it limited them and forced the gunmen to account for the soldiers' fields of fire. Throughout the day, the regulators remained inside McSween's compound, counting on thick adobe walls to stop most bullets. Their own rifles answered shots from the house and from Sheriff George Pepin's men. At times, a brief lull passed across the town as both sides adjusted positions or waited for a clearer target. Then a single shot would ring out, followed by answering fire from 3 or 4 points, and the cycle continued. The soldiers stayed on their assigned lines, rifles ready, sometimes returning fire when rounds struck close enough to show that they were being targeted, but mostly holding until they could carry out another evacuation run. Late in the day, after more civilians had been escorted out and some distant firing had slackened, Dudley shifted the artillery. Gatling gun and howitzer were drawn into positions that dominated the approaches to the McSween house and to other structures held by the regulators. He did not order them to open fire on the buildings themselves. Their presence alone sent a clear message. If either faction tried to turn its guns fully against the troops or to drive families back into the fight, the army now had the means to reply with overwhelming force. As the sun dropped toward the horizon, smoke and dust thickened over Lincoln. The air inside the town stung eyes and throats. The ground carried a layer of spent cartridge cases and broken glass. The troopers of the 9th shifted weight from foot to foot, muscles aching from hours of standing under tension. Their faces showed fatigue and focus, They had spent the day in a place where every cross street could become a killing zone with little warning, and where they had to balance the pull of direct intervention against the limits of their orders. Sometime after dark, new flashes appeared near the McSween property, not from muzzle fire but from flames. A shed near the house caught first, then an outbuilding. Dry boards and stored goods fed the blaze. Wind pushed embers toward the main structure. Within a short time, sparks found the dry edges of the house roof and fire began to take hold. The orange glow painted the street and threw long shadows of men and buildings against the opposite walls. The firefight tilted into something worse. From inside the McSween house came shouts and calls as the men trapped there realized the danger. They had spent days trading shots with Pepin's forces and now found themselves facing a more immediate threat than bullets. Smoke pushed through cracks and doorways. Heat built against the walls. Attempts to beat back the flames only slowed what had already started. Outside, Pepin's men tightened their ring, waiting for the moment when the defenders would be forced out into the open yard. Dudley kept his troops in designated positions rather than ordering an assault into the area around the burning compound. The 9th soldiers stood at their posts, watching as sparks drifted upward and as figures moved against the light inside the compound walls. Some troopers who had helped women and children out earlier clenched their jaws when they heard desperate voices calling for protection. Their orders had not changed. They were there to prevent the battle from spreading further through the town and to guard non-combatants, not to decide the outcome between the warring factions. Before dawn on July 19th, the fire fully seized the McSween house. The roof collapsed inward with a rush of sparks and smoke. The men inside knew they could not stay. As the sky began to pale, a group of regulators, including McSween himself and several close allies, gathered near a doorway that opened onto the yard. They planned a fast run through the smoke and gunfire in the hope of reaching cover beyond the nearest fences and sheds. Others prepared to give covering fire from remaining openings as long as the structure held. When the door swung and the group burst into the yard, Pepin's men fired immediately from multiple directions. The yard became a deadly zone, churned by bullets. Some of the regulators made it across, dropping low behind brush piles or low walls. Others fell within a few strides of the doorway. McSween went down among them, shot as he tried to follow the first wave. Flames from the destroyed house lit the ground around the bodies. The smell of burned wood and scorched adobe mixed with the metallic scent of blood. Buffalo soldiers of the 9th watched from their posts along side streets and open lots. They saw the movement and heard the final outburst of close gunfire, but they did not move into the yard. Their role in that moment remained limited to keeping anyone else from turning the chaos into an excuse to start new firing elsewhere in town or to harm civilians who had taken shelter in buildings now under Army watch. Where families tried to peer out, soldiers ordered them back from windows and reminded them that the danger was not yet past. By full daylight, the shooting had nearly stopped. The regulators who survived the breakout filtered away in small groups, slipping past the edges of the Army's loose cordon into the surrounding hills and brush. Many would never again gather in Lincoln in such strength. On the Murphy and Dolan side, men walked the street with a mix of triumph and exhaustion, looking at the burned ruin of the McSween home and at the places where their own dead and wounded lay. Dudley's troops still held their positions, faces expressionless as they watched armed men move under the strain of nights without sleep. In the hours that followed, the soldiers helped clear the streets. They allowed wagons to carry away bodies under supervision. They oversaw the movement of wounded men from both sides to places where doctors could reach them. They continued to escort families from houses that had been caught between lines. The obvious combat phase had ended, but the regiment treated Lincoln as still under arms until it could be sure no new clash would erupt that day. Across the territory, word of the 5-day battle and its end spread. Many accounts mentioned Billy the Kid and McSween, Others focused on the factional politics and on Dudley's later investigation. Among people who made a living on the edge of the law, one detail stood out. Troops from Fort Stanton, including black troopers of the 9th Cavalry, had marched into a town that had become a killing ground, brought artillery and a Gatling gun, and held the streets until the shooting stopped. Men who had once dismissed Buffalo soldiers as useful only for escort work now had to consider that when a fight grew large enough to threaten an entire settlement, those same troopers could arrive with enough disciplined force to end it, even in a place as tangled and violent as Lincoln. August 6, 1880. Heat pressed down on the Trans-Pecos before the sun cleared the broken ridgeline above Rattlesnake Springs. In the shallow basin where the water seeped from the ground, cottonwoods lifted narrow crowns of leaves over a few muddy pools. Around them the land rose in jagged folds of rock and brush, the outer fingers of the Sierra Diablo. On a slight rise east of the springs, black cavalrymen of the 10th United States Cavalry lay behind low stone ridges and rifle pits scraped out in the night, carbine barrels angled toward the canyon that led in from the south. Their horses stood farther back in a shielded draw, reins looped over makeshift picket lines, heads low after a brutal forced march that had brought them here ahead of the enemy they were waiting for. 2 days earlier, Victorio and his Warm Springs and Mescalero Apaches had crossed the Rio Grande again, moving north after their setback at Tinaja de las Palmas. The band had slipped past earlier blocking positions, slipping through gaps in the cavalry screen in the dark and climbing back onto the dry uplands. Scouts and ranchers carried word to army officers that the raiders were heading toward the Guadalupe Mountains and the higher ground of New Mexico. Colonel Benjamin Grierson studied the map and ignored the first obvious route. He knew that any band crossing that country would have to find water long before reaching the mountains. Rattlesnake Springs lay in a narrow slot north of Van Horn, one of the few reliable sources in that direction. He gambled everything on the idea that Victorio needed that water as much as his own men did. From a supply camp near Van Horn's well, Grierson gathered companies C and G of the 10th and ordered a march that pushed men and horses close to breaking. Through one afternoon, one night, and part of the next day, the column moved across open desert, covering roughly 65 miles in less than 21 hours. The ground under the horses' hooves changed from loose sand to hardpan to scattered stones. Men leaned forward in the saddle, eyes stinging from dust, lips cracked and dry under the thick air. During brief halts, troopers slid to the ground, stretched burning legs and poured measured sips from nearly empty canteens into their mouths and over the noses of their mounts. The forced ride cost Grierson several animals that went down and could not be raised. But it brought his buffalo soldiers into the defile above Rattlesnake Springs before Victorio arrived. By darkness on August 5th, the black troopers worked in near silence to prepare the ground. Under the direction of Captain Charles Vila and other officers, they laid out firing lines along low ridges that overlooked the canyon mouth. Men used bayonets, mess plates, and bare hands to scrape shallow rifle pits in the stony soil. They rolled loose rocks into crude breastworks, building small barricades that would break incoming bullets. A handful of white officers from Fort Davis moved among the men, checking sectors of fire and spacing. Lanterns were kept hooded, orders moved in whispers or quiet hand signals. The springs themselves lay behind the main line, a string of small pools half hidden under brush and tree roots. Grierson's plan hinged on those few pockets of water. Victorio's band had been riding and fighting for months. Every man in the column knew that the Apache horses and people would be as thirsty as their own. If the 10th could hold the water, the raiders could not linger in Texas. With that in mind, Grierson set a part of his force in the canyon facing south toward the route Victorio would likely take, and kept a reserve on the flanks and in rear positions where they could move quickly to plug any sudden attempt to slip through. Dawn came thin and hard. The sky turned from black to gray, then to a pale, washed color that offered no real relief from the heat that would follow. Troopers of the 10th lay on their stomachs behind stones, scanning the canyon approach. The land beyond their immediate position seemed empty, just ridges running out toward the Rio Grande and the faint, hazy line where the desert merged with sky. Horses in the rear shifted and stamped, jingling reins. The men in the line tasted last bits of old coffee on their tongues and adjusted their grips on carbines. Near mid-morning, a dust smear appeared in the distance, low at first, then taller. Scouts crawled to the edge of the ridge and looked down the canyon with field glasses. Figures moved in the haze, small at that range but distinct in pattern. Light animals, lean from long travel, moved in loose order, with mounted men spaced among them. Behind the leading group came more riders and a stretch of loose stock, the core of Victorio's remaining herd. The Apaches advanced at a steady walk, saving their mounts' strength for whatever lay beyond the bend they were entering. Grierson watched from a point just behind the main line, glasses pressed to his face. The band ahead of him had cut a path of raids and skirmishes for more than a year, killing settlers, attacking stage lines, and striking Mexican villages and ranches. Army detachments from several posts had chased Victorio across New Mexico, Arizona, Texas, and Chihuahua without breaking his force apart. Now the colonel had no intention of plunging into some scattered pursuit. He wanted to stop the band's movement through control of the one thing the desert would not give freely: water. He let the Apaches come on. Hidden behind the ridges above the springs, the buffalo soldiers lay still, bodies pressed into the dust, hats pulled low to cut the glare off their sights. Flies crawled along their collars and sleeves. Sweat trickled down spine and ribs, the only movement allowed. Seconds stretched as the leading elements of Victorio's band angled toward the canyon that led to the springs, unaware that rifles already covered the ground they would have to cross. The first warning came when a warrior in the front group stiffened in his saddle. Something in the way the ridges lay, or a glint of metal in the rocks, caught his eye. He pulled up and raised his hand. The line behind him checked. For a moment, both sides held. Then one of the Apache scouts turned his horse sharply to the side, peering toward a spot where the slope looked wrong. That small motion told Grierson the moment had arrived. He gave the order for his men to fire. The ridge above the canyon mouth erupted in a single, hard volley. Dozens of carbines vomited flame and smoke. Bullets tore into the leading group of Apaches and the animals carrying them. Horses reared and fell. Men pitched from saddles or clung desperately to reins as their mounts stumbled under the hits. The sudden noise crashed off the canyon walls, driving echoes down the gully. Dust leaped where rounds struck dry ground. The effect was immediate. The head of the column broke. Riders wheeled away from the canyon mouth, some dragging wounded comrades, others trying to control panicked horses that fought the bit. Victorio, somewhere farther back in the line, saw his advance guard slam into an invisible wall of fire. He had walked through ambushes before and knew better than to press straight into one. He pulled his people back out of carbine range, reforming them in rough order on the flats beyond the canyon entrance. The 10th did not pursue. They held their positions and reloaded, hands moving automatically through the drill. Cartridges slid into magazines and chambers. Levers worked. Spent brass rolled into the dust at the men's elbows. Eyes remained on the Apaches below, watching for any new movement toward the canyon. Grierson sent a small group of scouts along the flanks to check for signs that Victorio might be feeling for another way in. But the main line stayed anchored above the springs. The first clash had cost the Apaches valuable time and blood, but it did not break them. Men in Victorio's band led horses to a rough shelter of brush and rock beyond easy range of the ridge and took stock. Several animals lay dead or badly wounded. Some warriors had flesh wounds bandaged with strips of cloth. Thirst gnawed at them all. The nearest water lay behind the ridgeline where the black troopers waited. Other water holes were miles away, over country their mounts had already crossed after long days and nights. Victorio knew that if he failed to reach some source soon, the desert would do what no troop column had managed. A little after midday, the Apaches tried again. This time they approached in scattered groups, using every dip and fold in the ground to screen their advance. Small clusters of men and horses moved from rock to rock, staying low, pausing often. Some dismounted and led their animals, hoping that on foot they could find a gap in the Americans' fields of fire. Others worked around the flanks, probing the slopes for any place where a few warriors could climb under cover and pour fire down into the soldiers' positions. On the ridges, the buffalo soldiers adjusted to meet each probe. When a group of Apaches pushed too close to a particular fold in the ground, carbines in that sector opened up in short, controlled bursts, driving them back. Farther up the slope, a handful of troopers shifted to face a new angle of approach, their boots grinding lightly on loose stones, their eyes tracking movement below. Grierson sent a small reserve down one side of the basin to strike at an exposed cluster that was trying to climb toward the springs from an unexpected angle. The fight turned into a series of sharp exchanges. In one of them, an Apache party tried to rush a low saddle in the ridge that promised direct access to the water. The men sprinted forward, feet kicking dust, rifles held across their chests. The soldiers waiting above held until they could see individual faces and the movement of hair and cloth. When they fired, their rounds cut into the group at close range. One warrior pitched forward, his rifle spinning away. Another staggered, grabbed at his side, and fell back. The survivors dove for what little cover they could find and fired upward, bullets cracking over the troopers' heads and smashing chips from the stones. One black private cried out as a round tore through his arm. Medics pulled him back behind the main line and wrapped the wound tight while the others kept shooting. Later in the afternoon, Victorio shifted his efforts toward the flanks. He sent mounted men farther out, attempting to swing around the basin and come in behind the springs. Grierson anticipated the move and had already placed small detachments and scouts at other likely approaches. When the Apache riders tried to move through a side draw that looked promising from below, they ran into fire from troopers hidden along its rim. Once again, they were forced to pull back under the crack of repeating carbines. The hours wore on. The sun climbed high and began to drop again, baking the rocks and raising waves of shimmering air over the basin. On both sides, thirst tightened throats and heads pounded. Black cavalrymen sucked on empty canteen mouths for some hint of moisture and scraped sweat from under hatbands to wet their lips. The water in the springs behind them had to be rationed carefully. Animals were brought in small numbers at a time, allowed to drink under guard, then led away. The Apaches down below had no such access. Their horses' tongues lolled, their mouths dried to raw leather. Casualties among the 10th remained low but not non-existent. One trooper lay still behind a stone, eyes open to the washed sky, a dark stain spreading across his shirt. An officer who had stepped forward to direct fire in a hot sector fell when a bullet punched into his side. A medic dragged him back, hands slick with blood, while other men in the line fired past, faces hard. 10 horses lay scattered in shallow depressions or along the slope, bodies already swelling in the heat, flies gathering. The losses weighed on the command, but the line held. For the Apaches, the cost of each failed attempt came in more than numbers. Every burst of fire that drove them back also drove home the reality that the water remained unreachable. Victorio had built his campaign on mobility and knowledge of the land. He had slipped through cavalry screens, drawn small detachments into ambushes, and broken out of traps again and again. At Rattlesnake Springs, he ran into a different kind of enemy. one that did not chase his band blindly across the open desert, but instead ran ahead to the one place he needed and dug in. As the sun leaned toward the western ridges, the assault slackened. Apache rifle fire from beyond effective range continued, more out of anger and defiance than hope. Shots cracked across the basin, kicking dust near the soldiers' positions or striking uselessly into rock. The troopers of the 10th answered only when a target came close enough to justify another volley. Smoke drifted in thin strands from their carbines and from the Apache weapons beyond. Finally, as the light turned red along the horizon, the watchers on the ridge saw a change. The clustered forms below began to move away from the canyon, turning south and west. The band that had spent the day trying to force its way to the water now gathered itself for withdrawal. Small groups rode out first, guarding flanks and rear. Then the bulk of the herd and the remaining warriors followed, moving deeper into the broken country, toward the long trail back to Mexico. There was no sprint, no headlong flight, just a steady, grim retreat. Victorio had no other choice. Grierson did not hurl his worn men after them into the dark. He knew the condition of his horses and the state of his water supply. Officers and non-commissioned officers walked the ridgeline, checking on each trooper, making sure weapons were cleared and ammunition counted. Men rose slowly from the ground, backs stiff, knees protesting after hours crouched behind rocks. They looked down at the path the Apaches had taken away from the springs and at the bodies and dead animals left behind. The fight had not been a grand sweeping battle, but it had achieved what months of open pursuit had not. It had stopped Victorio in his attempt to move back toward his old range. Through the short desert night, the 10th held the springs. Sentries walked along the ridges, silhouettes against a sky crowded with stars. The air cooled enough that breath steamed again. In the basin below, fires flickered briefly on the horizon where the Apaches paused to tend their wounded and regroup before moving on. At Rattlesnake Springs itself, horses drank in strict order while troopers filled canteens and washed powder from their faces with cupped hands. The next days brought confirmation of the victory's depth. Other detachments from the 10th and allied units moved to guard additional water sources to the north and east, closing off options. A separate company under Captain Lebo pushed into the Sierra Diablo and destroyed an Apache supply camp, scattering the stores Victorio had hoped to use on his next moves. Together, the denial of water at Tinaja de las Palmas, the stand at Rattlesnake Springs, and the loss of supplies left the band with little choice but to turn fully back into Mexico. Word of the fight traveled slowly across the scattered ranches and towns of West Texas. In Van Horn, Isleta, and small settlements along the stage routes, men who had lived in fear of sudden Apache raids listened to riders describe how black cavalrymen had raced across the desert, beaten Victorio to the springs, and held the ground through repeated attacks. Stage drivers who had cursed the army in past years for failing to protect remote stops now found themselves repeating details of the stand, talking about black troopers in dusty blue coats who had lain in the rocks without flinching while some of the best fighters in the mountains tried and failed to break their line. Outlaws and cattle thieves who used the same country took careful note. For them, the exact number of dead on either side mattered less than the tactical pattern. A force of buffalo soldiers had read the land, moved at punishing speed, and used that knowledge to make the desert itself work as a weapon. Men who trafficked in stolen horses or crossed the Rio Grande with contraband knew that if the army chose to deny them water in that same way, their own escape routes could vanish under the sun. The casual talk that black cavalry units would never press so hard began to die out in those circles. Victorio's band continued to raid across the border for a short time, but the shape of the campaign had changed. Cut off from the springs and the routes that led toward his home country in New Mexico, the Apache leader never again pushed deep into the Trans-Pecos the way he had before. Weeks later, Mexican troops cornered his reduced band at Tres Castillos and ended his life with volleys fired into a camp that was short on ammunition and horses. When officers in the Department of Texas traced the path that led to that final scene, they marked Rattlesnake Springs as one of the turning points. For the black troopers who had dug into the stony ground around the springs and stared down into the canyon on that August day, the memory remained clear. They remembered the forced ride that dried their mouths and nearly killed their mounts. The first sight of Apache riders moving into the mouth of the canyon, the shock in those faces when the ridge spat fire, and the long, thirsty hours that followed. In earlier years, men along the frontier had laughed at the idea that black soldiers could match the desert's demands or outthink a seasoned raider like Victorio. On the hot rock above Rattlesnake Springs, buffalo soldiers of the 10th Cavalry had made that talk sound, empty, not with loud declarations, but with the simple fact that when a feared Apache war leader tried to force his way to water, it was their line that held and their fire that turned him back. December 1st, 1888. Cold air lay over the parade ground of a frontier post in the Arizona Territory as the 10th United States Cavalry formed under a pale winter sky. The sun had not yet cleared the ridge beyond the far edge of the fort, and the light that reached the assembled men came thin and sharp, turning the frost on the ground into a dull sheen. Rows of black troopers stood at attention beside their horses, dark blue coats buttoned high, carbines slung, gloves hiding cracked knuckles. Behind them, corrals, low adobe barracks, and storehouses marked a post that had seen years of movement, patrol, and sudden alarms. At the front of the line waited Colonel Benjamin Grierson, hat pulled low over his brow, greatcoat hanging straight from narrow shoulders. The bugle's call faded into the cold stillness. Hooves shifted, leather creaked a little where saddles settled, and then quiet returned. Grierson looked down the ranks of the regiment he had commanded since the mid-1870s, men whose faces showed the strain of a decade spent in hard country. These troopers had ridden the deserts of West Texas, the canyons of New Mexico, and the mountains and mesas of Arizona. They had chased raiding parties away from ranches and stage lines, guarded surveyors and railroad crews, and stood between angry crowds and fragile courts. Now, orders from the War Department directed changes in command that would remove him from direct leadership of the regiment. The date stamped on those orders gave this morning its weight. A regimental sergeant major stepped forward, voice cutting clearly across the ground as he read the text of a formal farewell prepared by the colonel. The words moved through the ranks in steady cadence. They spoke of long marches, of obedience under fire, of work done far from the public eye. They named no single battle, no single raid. But they summed up the years when the 10th had patrolled river crossings, guarded wagon trains, and stood on rocky ridges to hold water that enemies needed. Grierson's sentences described a regiment that had served without complaint in posts that other units had tried to avoid, accepting poor forage, worn equipment, and the scorn of men who considered themselves their betters, and still meeting every assignment given. Troopers listened without shifting. Some remembered the forced ride to reach springs in the Trans-Pecos when thirst had tightened every muscle and horses had begun to fall. Yet the officers had called for one more mile and the men had ridden it. Others thought of weeks spent in line with infantry around Apache reservations, watching for any sign that a small dispute might erupt into another round of flight and pursuit. A few carried scars on their arms and shoulders from close work with bandits and smugglers near the border, scars that barely showed above their collars now as they stood in the clear winter light. The farewell order did not dwell on those specifics, but the weight of them lay behind every line. When the reading ended, silence held the parade ground for a few moments. Then the sergeant major folded the paper and stepped back. Grierson advanced a few paces, heels crunching the thin frost, and stopped where each man in the front ranks could see his face clearly. He did not raise his voice to a shout. Years in the saddle had roughened it, but it still carried. He spoke openly about the quality of the regiment's service, about reports from inspecting officers that had ranked the 10th among the most efficient cavalry units in the army, and about the steady discipline that had kept its companies intact through hunger, thirst, and hostile fire. He acknowledged the prejudice that had trailed the regiment from its first days. White civilians along the frontier had mocked the very idea of black cavalry when the 9th and 10th were authorized. Some officers had accepted those views, giving the black regiments the worst mounts, the most remote posts, and the hardest fatigue duties. Grierson did not name names, but every man there knew how often the 10th had received worn saddles and broken wagons while other units drew better gear. In spite of that, the regiment's drill had sharpened until visiting officers wrote, in dry, formal language, that no regiment handled its horses better on the parade ground or on the approach to contact. As he spoke, the line of troopers remained still, but memory moved behind their eyes. Men who had been present when Rattlesnake Springs was held against repeated attacks remembered Apaches trying again and again to reach the water and finding only a wall of carbine fire. Others recalled nights spent riding between small Mexican mining camps and American towns, guarding payroll wagons that would otherwise have been easy prey for bandits who knew every cut in the hills. Younger troopers who had joined after those particular fights thought of their own first heavy assignments, of bone-deep fatigue on endless patrols, and of the way older sergeants had kept them moving when their legs felt like wood. In the town just beyond the post, word had already spread that Grierson's time with the regiment was ending. Merchants who had once treated black soldiers with contempt now spoke of them in more practical terms. They remembered occasions when troopers of the 10th had stopped lynch mobs from storming guardhouses or had ridden into remote camps to bring in men accused of killing over mining claims. Ranchers who had lost animals to rustlers but kept their lives because cavalry patrols came in time now talked about the regiment as a necessary presence rather than an experiment. Even among men who disliked federal authority, there was an acceptance that when the 10th was ordered out, the job would be done. That had not always been the case. In the early years after the war, outlaws and raiders along the Rio Grande and across the open plains had laughed at the thought of black troopers riding to face them. They had told each other that these soldiers would break at the first serious fight or would refuse to push far into hard country. Over the following decade, Buffalo soldiers disproved those assumptions through direct, repeated contact. When raiding parties found cavalry patrols standing firm in stage station yards instead of running, when convoys escorted by black troopers punched through ambushes with tight ranks and steady return fire, the stories that flowed through saloons and camps changed. Newspapers in places like San Antonio, El Paso, and Santa Fe sometimes reflected those shifts. Columns that once repeated rumors about unreliable colored troops began printing reports that named 9th and 10th Cavalry companies for actions that pushed raiders away from mail routes, recovered stolen stock, and escorted survey teams through contested land without losing a man. Editors who still held their own prejudices could not ignore numbers, miles patrolled, and convoys that reached their destinations. Army officers whose reports reached Washington described the black regiments as steady and reliable under field conditions. By 1888, the work of the 9th and 10th had helped change patterns of law enforcement across much of the remaining frontier. In Texas, the presence of black troopers on the roads and in garrisons along the border had made it harder for large armed bands to seize control of towns or stage routes without encountering regulars. In New Mexico, the knowledge that cavalry could ride in from Fort Stanton or other posts at short notice had altered the calculations of men who once relied on local sheriffs alone. In Arizona, where mining booms drew sudden crowds of desperate men into narrow canyons and rough towns, troopers of the 10th helped keep fights over claims from turning into full-scale uprisings. All of this, Grierson told his men, formed the record they carried forward as he stepped away. The regiment's reputation no longer depended on his personal command. It rested on the repeated fact that whenever the 9th or 10th arrived on a scene, they brought order backed by disciplined force. He reminded them that new officers would come, that posts would change, but that the standard of conduct already set could not be taken away by any transfer order. Black troopers who had joined the 10th in the late 1880s, some of them not yet born when the regiments were created, now inherited a name that outlaws, settlers, and Indian fighters all knew. After he finished speaking, the colonel paused, letting his gaze move once more down the line from one end of the regiment to the other. He then gave a simple command acknowledging their past and pointing toward their future. The sergeant major repeated it in louder tones, and the men brought their hands smartly to their caps. For a few seconds, every trooper and officer present held the salute. Then at the dropped arm of the regimental sergeant major, hands lowered again. The moment passed, but the memory of it lodged in the minds of the men on that cold ground. Later that morning, administrative tasks occupied the headquarters offices. Papers were signed, responsibility for equipment and property transferred, and incoming officers briefed on the state of the companies. Outside, the routine of a border post continued. Patrol orders were posted on the bulletin board. Details went out to cut wood, haul water, and repair corrals. Blacksmiths hammered at shoes for horses that would carry men on the next round of scouting. In the barracks, troopers rolled blankets and checked the few personal items they carried, preparing for inspections and for the possibility that orders might soon move them again. In the nearby town, news of the farewell spread beyond the garrison. At a livery stable, a stage driver told a younger man about the first time he had seen the 10th ride alongside his coach on a mountain road. Rain had turned the track into a slick ribbon, and men with rifles had waited above a narrow pass. The troopers had dismounted and moved along the slope, carbines held ready, eyes scanning for movement. When gunmen showed themselves along the ridge, the soldiers' first volley had been careful and measured, enough to break the ambush and send the attackers running without harming the draft animals. The driver's account ended with a simple conclusion. A man who drove mail and passengers across such country, he said, slept better knowing black cavalrymen could be assigned to his route. In a cantina where ranch hands and drifters gathered, the talk ran rougher but reached similar ends. A man who once herded stolen Mexican cattle north to hidden canyons told a story about meeting a 9th Cavalry patrol on a narrow trail. Years earlier, he would have expected to bluff his way through with a false bill of sale and a quick hand near his pistol. On that day, the black troopers had formed a line across the trail, checked brands carefully, and compared them to a written list of animals reported stolen. When they found a match, they had taken the herd back and escorted him under guard to a town where a United States Marshal waited. He described their manner as hard but consistent, without the casual cruelty shown by some white pauses he had known. It had been, he said bluntly, the end of his time in the rustling trade. Farther away, in towns that had never seen the 10th ride through, the legend of the Buffalo Soldiers grew in other forms. Veterans of the 9th and 10th who left the service and settled in civilian communities across the country carried their stories with them. They spoke in plain words about nights on picket duty under open sky, of long trails followed in silence, and of the way men who once scoffed at black soldiers now kept their voices lower when those regiments were mentioned. Their accounts moved into barbershops, church halls, and lodge rooms, threads from remote posts woven into the broader story of how the West had been brought under firmer control. In Washington, officers who had worked with the 9th and 10th on the frontier submitted formal reports and personal letters that reinforced those impressions. Some argued that the black regiments deserved better posts, better equipment, and fairer promotion opportunities. They pointed to years of reliable service, to casualty lists that showed black troopers had fallen on the same hard ground as anyone else, and to records of desertion and discipline that compared favorably with many white units. Those arguments did not erase racism in the Army or in civilian life, but they placed a documented record of performance against the assumptions that had once kept the regiments out of serious consideration. Back at the Arizona post where Grierson had said his farewell, the 10th Cavalry continued its routine as winter deepened. Patrols went out along the reservation boundaries and mining roads. Watch details scanned the horizon for smoke or dust that might signal movement. Young officers rode with veteran sergeants, hearing first-hand accounts of earlier campaigns along the Rio Grande, in New Mexico valleys, and on the Texas plains. Around evening fires, troopers traced with their hands in the dirt the lines of old marches, showing where water had been found, where ambush had been expected, and where enemies had turned back under fire. In distant camps where men planned robberies or cross-border raids, conversations about the Army took on a different tone than they had 20 years earlier. When someone spoke of cavalry interference, another man might ask which regiment held the nearest post. If the answer named the 9th or 10th, shoulders squared and voices grew more serious. The men planning trouble knew that those regiments did not spook easily, that they had pressed across hot plains where others turned back and had held their ground in tight towns where gunfire bounced between walls. By the time December 1888 drew to its close, the West that had seemed open to any man with a horse and a rifle had changed. Railroads tied distant regions together. Telegraph lines carried news that once would have taken weeks to travel. Federal posts dotted borders and passes that had been wide open a generation earlier. Within that transformed landscape, the Buffalo Soldiers of the 9th and 10th Cavalry stood as part of the framework that held the new order in place. Their presence had not erased violence or lawlessness, but it had narrowed the spaces where outlaws and raiders could act without rapid response. On the morning when Colonel Benjamin Grierson stood before his regiment and delivered his farewell, many of those changes had already taken root. The men in the ranks, black troopers whose names rarely appeared in formal histories, had helped carve those changes into the face of the country with their sweat, their patience, and their willingness to ride into danger when ordered. They had entered service in an army that doubted them and had earned respect not by asking for it but by doing their work under harder conditions than most. As the formation on that cold Arizona parade ground broke up and troopers led their horses back toward the corrals, the 10th Cavalry remained what it had become through long experience, a regiment known across the frontier as a hard-riding, steady-fighting unit that raiders and outlaws took seriously. The laughter that had once greeted the idea of black cavalry in frontier saloons and camps had long since faded. In its place stood a quieter, more grudging acknowledgement. When trouble grew large enough to draw federal attention, and when orders went out to send cavalry to meet it, the prospect of black horsemen in dark coats bearing down through dust or snow now gave those on the wrong side of the law a new and enduring reason to fear the United States Army.